Chapter 29. The star that warmed Naos 3 was a white blur, low on the horizon. Ominous clouds obscured the mountains to Obi-Wan's right. Snow was falling harder. Tearing into it as fast as the sled would carry him, he felt as if he had run smack into a blizzard. The lovely crystalline flakes would have been like pellets against his face and hands if not for the force. Even so, he could barely see, and the ice, gray, white, and sometimes blue, was nowhere near as smooth as he had thought it would be. Pebbly where surface water had thawed and refrozen countless times, mounded up over debris trapped during the freeze, pocked by fishing holes, reaped high with ice that had filled the holes. Matters weren't helped any by the fact he was being shot at. Bolts from the repeating blaster on the bridge had him weaving all over the river, slaloming around ice dams and leaping small mounds. The repulsor lift would have allowed him to fly over the obstacles, as Anakin was doing further downriver, but Obi-Wan just couldn't get the hang of it. More to the point, engaging the repulsor lift required using two hands, and just now he had none to spare. His left was gripped on the controller bar/throttle, his right tight on the hilt of his ignited lightsaber, as he fended off bolts from above and beyond. For a moment he was back on Munilis, jousting with Dirge's speeder-freak Lancer droids. Except for the snow. A vacillating roar in his right ear told him that one of the pursuit sleds had caught up with him. Out of the corner of his streaming eye, Obi-Wan saw the sled's human pilot bend low over the control bars to provide his Rodian rider with the clearance he needed to send a blaster bolt through Obi-Wan's head. Braking, Obi-Wan allowed the sled to come alongside more quickly than the Rodian had planned. The rider's first shot raced past Obi-Wan's eyes. The second, he deflected slightly downward, straight into the sled's engine. The machine exploded instantly, flinging pilot and rider head over heels in opposite directions. Quickly, however, a second sled was catching up. This one carried a pilot only, but a more skillful one. Twisting the throttle, the pilot drove his sled into Obi-Wan's, trying to send it spinning out of control, or better still, into the trunk of a massive tree that was protruding acutely from the thick ice. Narrowly missing the latter, Obi-Wan went into a sideways skid. Overcorrecting, he added spin to his slide and couldn't resume his course until the sled had been whipped through half a dozen counter-rotations. By then, his crash-helmeted pursuer was well positioned to ram him a second time, but Obi-Wan was ready for him. Turning sharply, he steered into the pursuit sled, hanging on through the jarring collision, then directing a force push at the rebounding pilot. The sled shot forward as if supercharged, with the pilot all but dangling from the control bars. Speeding up the face of a hummock, the craft went airborne, then ballistic, plummeting into a thinly iced-over fishing hole at an angle that took machine and rider both deep under solid ice. Water geysered into the air, drenching Obi-Wan as he raced past. The third sled was still clinging to his tail, and blaster bolts were whizzing past his ears. Up ahead, he saw Anakin and Fall, leading their sled through a sweeping turn to the south between two of Naos 3's many hills. Lethal hyphens of light streaked down from the bridge that linked the hills, but not one found Anakin or Fall. Unable to replicate Anakin's deft turns, Obi-Wan was falling farther behind with each quarter kilometer, and was now making himself an easy target for the assassins on the bridge. With no hope in negotiating the hail of fire, he maneuvered the sled through a long turn away from the span, but no sooner did he emerge from his half-circle than he found himself on a collision course with the last of the pursuit sleds. The inevitability of a head-on crash left him no choice but to abandon his machine for what was going to be a very long slide on the ice. But just short of his leap, a bolt in the jagged line the bridge gunners were stitching along the river caught the pilot of the onrushing machine in the chest, hurling him into the air. Twisting the throttle, Obi-Wan swerved around the pilotless sled and continued to race upriver out of range of the blasters. To his right, a clamor built over the hill, and the shadow of something large and swift fell over him. A repeating blaster clacked repeatedly, fracturing the ice directly in his path and opening a wide, surging breach of agitated water. Uncertain he could leap the gap even if he wanted to try, Obi-Wan applied the brakes hard. The sled was 10 meters from the ice-chunked fissure when a metal claw dropped over him, snapping shut and plucking him from the seat. Wrenched from his hand, his lightsaber flew into the ice, and the sled sailed off into the frothing water. "Star's End," Obi-Wan muttered. Suspended on a swaying cable, the claw began to ascend toward the open belly of a graceless snow skiff. Red hands clamped around Anakin's waist. Fall swooped and shouted, clearly enjoying herself, even through the days of too many drinks, or more likely because of them. You missed your calling, Jedi, she shouted into his right ear. You could have been a champion pod racer. Been there, done that, Anakin said over his shoulder. It was then that he caught sight of Obi-Wan being lifted from his sled. Bringing brakes and thrusters to bear, Anakin powered the sled through a fast 180 and shot back upriver, under the bridge they had just left behind, dodging the unrelenting fire of hand blasters. Sharp-tooth collector, Fala explained when she saw the snow skiff. Gathers catch, so the fishers won't have to ferry their loads into the city. That's what I do here. My job, such as it is. The claw that had Obi-Wan in his grip was halfway to the skiff. I don't see any way of reaching him in time, Fal said. Get ready to take the control bars, Anakin said. Fal's hands clutched his robe. Where are you planning to go? Up. Pouring on all speed, Anakin steered the sled up the side of the hill that supported one half of the bridge. At the zenith of the climb, he engaged the repulsor lift. Then, leaping from the now rocketing sled, he called on the Force to propel himself toward the swaying cage. The pilots of the skiff saw him coming and banked hard to starboard, but not soon enough to prevent Anakin from latching onto the claw. A Rodian in the co-pilot's chair cracked open the door and began firing down at his moving target. I had a feeling you'd show up, Obi-Wan said from inside the claw. A lucky shot from above hit the cage and ricocheted. Hang on, Master. This isn't going to be pretty. Obi-Wan heard the snap hiss of Anakin's lightsaber. Peering through the metal fingers of the claw, he saw what was coming. Anakin, wait! But there was no stopping him. As the claw came within reach of the cargo hold, Anakin swung his lightsaber and sliced open the floor of the skiff's cockpit. Sparks and smoke poured from the rend, and almost immediately the craft slewed to starboard. Passing within a meter of one of the bridge towers, it began to twirl toward the hillside. An instant before the crash, Anakin severed the claw cable, and the cage plummeted, striking the slippery ground and racing down to the frozen river, out onto the ice, spinning crazily, with Obi-Wan bouncing around inside, and Anakin force-fastened to the outside, through all the unpredictable pitches and tumbles. The skiff crashed into the hillside. By the time the claw came to a rest on the far side of the river, the two Jedi were so covered in snow they looked like wampas. Anakin's lightsaber made short work of the fingers of the claw. Obi-Wan scrambled out, spitting snow and shaking like a hound. That has to make it 40. Stop, Obi-Wan said. I concede. He paused to empty the sleeves and hood of his sodden cloak. Where's Fall? Anakin scanned the hillsides. The assassins on the bridge had packed up and fled. Ultimately, he pointed toward the opposite bank of the river, where a sled was wedged between two mounds of ice. When they reached her, Fala was laying face down a few meters from the machine, which had been holed by blaster fire. Gently turning her over, Anakin saw that one bolt had amputated the Twi'lek's right leku. Her eyes blinked open, focusing on him as he cradled her in his arms. Don't tell me, she said weakly. I'm going to live, right? Sorry to be the bearer of bad news. A week in Bacta and you'll be as good as new, Obi-Wan said. Fal sighed. I won't hold it against you. You did your best to get me killed. She gazed around. Shouldn't we be looking for cover? They're gone, Anakin said. Fal shook her head. After all these years, they finally... I don't think so, Obi-Wan interrupted. Someone more important than Wraith Sinar doesn't want us to learn too much about the Star Courier. Then I'd better tell you the rest. About Coruscant, I mean. Anakin raised her up. Where'd you deliver the ship? To an old building in the industrial corridor, west of the Senate, an area called the Works. Chapter 30. Macro binoculars pressed to his eyes, Mace studied the distant building top to bottom, his gaze lingering on broken windows, fissured ledges, canted balconies. Central to a complex of half a dozen structures, the building was more than 3 centuries old and going to ruin. For 2/3 of its towering height, it was an unadorned pillar with a rounded summit. Support for the superstructure was afforded by a circular base, reinforced by massive fins. Where the superstructure and the sloped tops of the buttresses met, the building was fenestrated by windows and antiquated gear-toothed docking gates. Many of the permaglass panels and skylights were intact, but time and corrosion had done their worst to the vertical hatches of the docking gates. An investigation was underway to determine who had raised the building and who owned it, although judging by its location and prominence in the works, it appeared to have served as corporate headquarters for the factories and assembly plants that surrounded it. Mace and his team of Jedi, cloned commandos, and intelligence analysts were a kilometer east of the structure, in an area of squat, peak-roof foundries, lorded over by smoke-belching permacrete stacks. A more dispiriting place this side of Iriadu or Korriban would have been hard to find, Mace told himself. 5 hours spent here could take 5 years off someone's life. He could feel the damage with every breath he took, every grimy surface he touched, every vagrant poisoned whiff that wafted his way. The acids in the air were fast digesting everything, but not quickly enough for some. Ambitious developers and urban renewalists had deliberately introduced stone mites, duracrete slugs, and conduit worms to aid and abet the caustic rain, without heed for the risks such vermin posed to the nearby skyscrapers of the Senate District. All in all, a perfect environment for a Sith Lord. "Probe droids are away, General Windu," the Ark reported. Mace trained the macro binoculars on the flock of meter-wide spherical droids that were maneuvering with purposeful unevenness toward the building. The Senate Intelligent Oversight Committee had attempted to interdict the use of commandos and probe droids. In the minds of the committee members, the idea that a separatist stronghold could exist on Coruscant was absurd. Fortunately, and admittedly unexpectedly, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine had overruled the committee, and Mace had been allowed to compile a dream team that included not only Arc Commander Valiant and Captain Dine of Republic Intelligence, but also Jedi Master Shaak Ti and several capable Padawans. "No indications that the probes are being targeted," the Ark updated. Mace watched the black spheres begin to drift through shattered windows and into areas of the superstructure, where the building's facade had disintegrated and the bones of its plasteel skeleton were exposed. "Moment of truth," he thought. The Lothan pilot Obi-Wan and Anakin had searched out on Naus 3 hadn't been able to furnish anything more than a portrait of the building to which she had delivered the Star Courier. A product of Sinar Advanced Projects Laboratory, the craft had been modified, perhaps unwittingly by Sinar itself, for the Sith who had killed Qui-Gon Jinn. The pilot had been provided with landing coordinates on Coruscant, but, in fact, the courier itself had homed in on those. Paid in full for her services, she had been taxied to Westport and had left for Ryloth soon after. The physical description of the courier's destination hadn't given the Jedi much to go on. Though more horizontal than most areas of equatorial Coruscant, the work sprawled for hundreds of square kilometers and contained thousands of buildings that could have fit the description. A break hadn't come until Jedi Master Thulm had recalled a detail from the debriefing of his former Padawan Quinlan Vos. As part of Vos's covert mission to penetrate Count Dooku's inner circle of dark-side apprentices, Vos had been tasked with assassinating a duplicitous senator named Viento. Immediately following the assassination and a brutal duel with Master Karuk, Vos had met briefly with Dooku in the works. There, Dooku had informed his would-be protege that Vos had been incorrect in assuming that Viento was a Sith, and had again denied that he himself answered to any master. At the time, no one had paid much attention to Vos's remarks, because Vos seemed to have been seduced by the dark side and lost to the Order. The rendezvous was considered to have been only that, an out-of-the-way meeting place. Of greater interest to the Jedi and Republic intelligence was the fact that Dooku had managed to arrive at and depart Coruscant without detection. "Hollow images of the interior coming in," Valiant said. Mace lowered the macro binoculars and shifted his gaze to the fuel holoprojector. Dazzled by diagonal lines of static, the 3D images were of forlorn rooms, stretches of dark corridor, vast empty spaces. "The building appears to be completely abandoned, General. No signs of droids or living beings, other than varieties common to similar manufacturing slums." "Abandoned, perhaps, but not forgotten," Captain Dine said from behind Valiant. "The building's live. It has power and illumination." "Doesn't mean much," Mace said. "Many structures in this district were self-powered, often by dangerous, highly unstable fuels." He gestured broadly. "They're still belching smoke." Dine nodded. "But this one shows periodic and recent use of power." Mace turned to Valiant. "All right, Commander. Give the go-ahead." From behind and to both sides of the observation port, lats lifted off into the smoke-filled sky, doorway gunners traversing their repeating blasters and commandos standing ready to deploy from the gunship's troop bay. Elsewhere, ATTEs and other mobile artillery vehicles began to lumber across the debris-filled urbanscape toward their target. Valiant turned to the troopers who made up our Rook team. The building is a free strike zone. You're to consider anyone we find inside to be hostile. He slammed a fresh power pack into his short-stock blaster. Troopers, find, fix, finish. No matter how often he heard it, the grunting communal response to the Ark's rallying cry continued to disturb Mace on some level. Although it was probably no different from what the clone troopers heard when the Jedi said to one another, "May the Force be with you." He swung and waved a signal to Shaak Ti. "I'll ride with a Rook team. You have Bacta." As beautiful as a flower, as deadly as a viper, Shaak Ti was the Jedi Master one wanted by one's side in chaotic circumstances. Graced with the ability to move quickly through crowds or tight spots, she was often the first to wade into close-quarter engagements. Her striped montrails and lengthy head-tail alert to distances, her blue lightsaber quick to find its mark. She had proved instrumental in the defense of Camino and Brental 4, and Mace was glad to have her with him now. A Rook team's gunship was already packed with commandos and Padawans by the time he clambered inside. Lifting off, the Lat aimed straight for the summit of the building. The strategy was to work from the top down, in the hope of flushing hostiles out through the lowest levels, where infantry and artillery units were already taking up firing positions around the buttressed base. The entire area was undermined with tunnels that had been used for transporting workers, droids, and materials. While it was impossible to monitor every entrance and egress, many of the principal tunnels that opened on the building's sub-basements had been outfitted with sensors capable of detecting droids or flesh and bloods. No functioning docking bay large enough to accommodate a gunship had been discovered. The commandos had advocated blowing a gaping hole in the side of the superstructure, but engineers feared that an explosion of the strength required could very well collapse the entire structure. Instead, the Lat carried the team to the largest of the blown-out windows below the summit and hovered there while everyone was inserted. Leaping the gap, Mace activated his lightsaber and instructed the Padawans to follow suit. Weapons raised to their chests, the commandos spread out in fire and maneuver squads, and began to move deeper in the building, checking out each room and alcove before declaring any level secure. Mace's blade glowed amethyst in the gloom. Stretching out with the Force, he could feel the presence of the dark side. The only explanation for Quinlan Voss not having felt it was that he, too, had gone dark. Yoda had warned Mace that the dark side might cloud his mind to certain rooms and passageways, places that the Sith Lords didn't want Mace to discover, but he felt alert in all ways. Besides, that was what the commandos were for. They worked their way down and down without encountering resistance or finding anything of interest. "Quiet as a tomb, General," Valiant said when the top 10 levels had been secured. Mace studied the 3D map displayed by the Ark's wrist gauntlet projector. "Inform Bacta team we will rally with them in designated Sector 3. Valiant was about to speak when his comlink toned. "Commander, this is Bacta team leader," a voice said. "We have a functioning docking gate on level 6 that shows evidence of recent use. And sir, wait until you get a look at the landing zone." The floor that served as a landing area was scarcely large enough for a gunship, but it gleamed as if scrubbed and polished daily by custodial droids. Parallel to the long sides of the rectangle were banks of slender blue illuminators. "Everyone, stay exactly where you are," Captain Dine said, when Mace and the rest of a Rook team appeared at the mouth of a corridor that intersected the docking bay at its lengthwise center point. Deployed in a circular formation, Shaak Ti and the Padawans who had entered with Bacta were clustered in the middle of the floor. 30 meters to Mace's right, Dine and 2 other intelligence officers were interpreting the data being sent to them by several probe droids meandering with design throughout the room, some of them misting the floor with a highly volatile substance. The well-lubricated vertical docking gate was open, revealing an oval of blackened sky. "A hoopla Pasatik sloop occupied this docking bay less than 2 standard weeks ago," Dine said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The arrangement of its landing gear and aft boarding ramp matched the footprint of the Ponwarka 116 class that launched from Geonosis during the battle there. "Dooku's ship," Mace said. "A reasonable supposition, Master Windu," Dine said loudly. After several moments of gazing at the monitor screens of his equipment and conferring with his associates, he added, "The floor reveals traces of 2 beings who were here, contemporaneous with the sloop." Green light from one of the drifting droids played across the alloy floor panels. Dine directed the droid to concentrate on certain areas and studied the data again. "The first being exited the sloop and walked to this point." He indicated an area close to the open gate. Taking into consideration trace impressions and the length of the being's stride, I would hazard that being 1 stands 195 centimeters in height and was wearing boots. It was Dooku, Mace thought. The droid focused its lights on another area, and Dine continued. Here, being 1 met with being 2, lighter in weight, perhaps shorter in stature, and wearing... Dine consulted what Mace assumed to be some sort of database. What can best be described as soft-soled footwear or slippers. This unknown being came from the direction of the building's east turbolifts and accompanied Dooku, for all intents and purposes, to a balcony niche above the docking gate. Following the same route, the pair returned to the docking bay and separated, Dooku to his ship, our unknown quarry, presumably to the turbolifts. Tasking the probe droids to track the prints of the second being, Dime began to trail them, waving for Mace, Shaak Ti, and the commandos to follow. Single file behind me, Dine cautioned, no straying out of line. Mace and Shaak Ti took the points, while the Padawans and commandos strung out behind. By the time the 2 Jedi Masters caught up with Dine and his droids, the intelligence analyst was standing at the door to a dated turbolift. Verified, Dine said, grinning in self-satisfaction. Being 2 used the turbolift. Turning to the wall, he pressed his gloved right hand to the call stud. When the summoned car appeared, he affixed a scanner to the control pad inside. The car's memory tells us it arrived from Sub-Basement 2. If we fail to discover evidence of our unknown quarry there, we'll have to work our way back up, 1 level at a time until we do. The turbolift was just roomy enough for Dine, his associates, Mace, Shaak Ti, the 2 team commanders, and 2 probe droids. Comlinking troopers outside the building, Valiant ordered them to make their way to Sub-Basement 2, but forewarned them to stay clear of the east turbolift and any nearby corridors or tunnels. The probe droids were first to exit the car when it stopped, missing the corridor in both directions. One of the droids had gone 5 meters before it stopped in mid-flight and began playing its detection lights across the floor. Footprints, Dine said with enthusiasm. We're still on track. Stepping carefully from the car, he followed the probe droids to the entrance of a wide tunnel. After the droids had disappeared inside and returned, Dine swung to Mace, who was waiting with everyone else at the base of the turbolift. The prints end here. From this point on, the unknown used a vehicle, certainly a repulsor lift of some sort, although the droids aren't detecting any phantom emissions. Mace and Shaak Ti joined Dine and his teammates at the tunnel entrance. Shaak Ti peered into the darkness. Where does it lead? Dine consulted a holo map. If we can trust a map that's older than any of us, it connects to tunnels all over the works, to adjacent buildings, to the foundries, to a one-time landing field. There must be 100 branches. Forget the branches, May said. What's at the far end of this one? Dine called up a series of displays and studied them in silence. At last he said, the principal tunnel leads all the way to the western limit of the Senate District. Mace walked 2 meters into the darkness and ran his hand on the tunnel's tiled wall. Hundreds of senators are now under the influence of a Sith Lord called Darth Sidious, Dooku had told Obi-Wan and Geonosis. Turning to face Shaak Ti and the clone commanders, Mace said, we're going to need more troops. Chapter 31. In the Supreme Chancellor's Senate office building chambers, Yoda sat staring across the desk at Palpatine, silhouetted against the long window that overlooked western Coruscant. How many Supreme Chancellors had he sat with in this office and others like it, he asked himself. 100 now. But why with this one did discussions so often skirt the edge of confrontation, especially when the topic turned to the Force? As ineffectual a leader as he was, Phineas Valorum had tried to comport himself as if he placed the Force above all. With Palpatine, the Force was not placed last. It wasn't even on the agenda. I understand your concerns entirely, Master Yoda, he was saying. More important, I am sympathetic to them. But the Outer Rim sieges must continue, despite what you may think, and notwithstanding the extraordinary powers the Senate has deemed fit to bestow on me these past 5 years. I am one voice in a welter. At long last the Senate is galvanized to end this destructive conflict, and it will not permit me to stand in the way. Exhort me you need not, Supreme Chancellor, Yoda said. Palpatine smiled dryly. I apologize if I sounded sermonizing. Galvanized by your State of Republic address, the Senate was. My address was a reflection of the spirit of the times, Master Yoda. What's more, I spoke from my heart. Doubt you, I do not, but too soon your encouragements came. Celebrates imminent victory, Coruscant does, when far from ended the war is. Palpatine's frown contained a hint of warning, of malice. After 3 years of fear, Coruscant craves relief. Agree with you, I do. But how from the seizure of Outer Rim worlds is relief sustained? Too many new fronts, the Senate urges us to open. Too dispersed the Jedi are to serve effectively. A reasonable strategy we lack. My military advisors would not be pleased to hear you categorize their strategy as irrational. Need to hear it, they do. Say it to them, I will. Palpatine paused to consider the remark, then leveled a hard gaze. Master Yoda, forgive my frankness, but if the Jedi are indeed too widely scattered to coordinate the sieges, then the burden will have to fall to my naval commanders. Yoda compressed his lips and shook his head. Answer foremost to the Jedi our troopers do. Forged in alliance with them we have. Forged in fire this fidelity has been. Palpatine sat upright as if struck. I'm certain I misconstrue your meaning, but you almost make it sound as if our army was created for the Jedi. Not true, Yoda snapped, for the Republic and none other. Appeased, Palpatine said, then perhaps the clones can be trained to respond to others, as well as they respond to the Jedi. Yoda made a glum face. Trained the troopers can be, but wrong the strategy remains. May I ask that you think back to Geonosis? Do you not agree that we erred then by not pursuing the Separatists? Unprepared we were, knew the army was. Granted, but we are prepared now. We have the Confederacy on the run from the inner systems, and I will not allow us to repeat the mistake we made at Geonosis. No, a different mistake we make now. Palpatine interlocked his fingers. This is the wisdom of the Council? It is. Then you will challenge the Senate's decision? Yoda shook his head. Sworn by oath to uphold you, we are. Palpatine spread his hands. That does not instill confidence, Master Yoda. If it's nothing more than an oath, then you are duty-bound to reconsider. Reconsidered we have, Supreme Chancellor. You imply no threat, I trust. No threat. Palpatine forced a fatigued exhale. As I've told you on many occasions, I do not have the luxury of seeing this world through the Force. I see only the real world. No problem there would be, if the real world all there was. Unfortunately, we who are not attuned to the Force have that on Jedi authority alone. Yoda wagged his forefinger at Palpatine. To end this war, more we will have to do than defeat Grievous and his army of war machines. More we will have to do than seize remote worlds. These Sith to whom you keep referring, Palpatine fell silent in thought, then said, When you were believed killed at Ithor, Master Windu said as much to me. More attentive to his concerns, were you? Palpatine regarded him. A skilled duelist you are. When need be, Supreme Chancellor. You never fully described what went on between you and Count Dooku on Vajjoon. Was he at all inclined to return to the Order, to the side of the Republic? Yoda allowed his sadness to show. From the dark path no returning there is. Forever the direction of your life it dominates. That may make Dooku difficult to rehabilitate. Yoda raised his gaze. Captured he will never be. Die fighting he will. This Darth Sidious as well. Should Dooku be found and killed? Yoda's eyes fidgeted. Difficult to say. Deprived an apprentice, Sidious may withdraw, to preserve the Sith. One person is all that's required to preserve the Sith traditions? Traditions they are not. The dark side it is. Then what if you should find Sidious first and kill him? Would Dooku's power increase? Only Dooku's determination. Different it will be, because a Sith late he has become. Yoda shook his head. Hard to know if Dooku a true Sith is, or simply with the power of the dark side infatuated. And General Grievous? Yoda made a gesture of dismissal. More a machine than alive, Grievous is, though more dangerous for it. But without Dooku's or Sidious's leadership, collapse the Separatists will. Bound together by the Sith they are, mortared by the dark side of the Force. Palpatine leaned forward with interest. Then the Council is of the opinion that we must kill the leadership? That this war is more a battle within the Force? United we are in that matter. You are persuasive, Master Yoda. You have my word that I will bear this conversation in mind when I meet with the Senate to discuss our campaigns. Relieved I am, Chancellor Palpatine. Palpatine reclined in his chair. Tell me, how goes the hunt for Darth Sidious? Yoda leaned forward for emphasis. Coming closer to him, are we? Chapter 32. In a forward hold of Grievous's flagship, Dooku watched the cyborg general duel with his elite Magna Guards, 3 of his trophy lightsabers in constant motion, parrying thrusts of the guards' pulse weapon staffs, slicing the recycled air a hairbreadth from the expressionless faces of his opponents, incapacitating arm and leg servos when he could. Grievous was a force to be reckoned with, to be sure, but Dooku deplored his habit of collecting lightsabers. It had merely bothered him that Ventress and lesser combatants such as the bounty hunter Aurra Sing had adopted the foul practice. Grievous's habit struck Dooku as the worst kind of profanation. Even so, he was not about to discourage the practice. The more Jedi that should be dispatched, the better. The only aspect of Grievous's technique that vexed him more was the general's penchant for using 4 blades. 2 was bad enough, in the form they had been used by Darth Maul, or in Anakin Skywalker's sad attempt to employ the technique on Geonosis. But 3? What was to become of elegance and gallantry if a duelist couldn't make do with 1 blade? Well, what had become of elegance and gallantry in any case? Grievous was fast, and so were his IG-100 series sparring partners. They had the advantage of size and brute strength. They executed moves almost faster than the human eye could follow. Their thrusts and lunges demonstrated a singular lack of hesitancy. Once committed to a maneuver, they never faltered. They never stopped to recalculate their actions. Their weapons went exactly where they meant them to go, and they always aimed for points beyond their opponents in order to slice clear through. Dooku had taught Grievous well, and Grievous had taught his elite well. Coupled with Dooku's coaching, their programming in the 7 classic forms of lightsaber dueling, in the Jedi arts, made them lethal opponents. But they were not invincible, not even Grievous, because they could be confused by unpredictability, and they had no understanding of finesse. A player of Dejarik could memorize all the classic openings and counter moves and still not be a master of the game. Defeat often came at the hands of less experienced players who knew nothing about the traditional strategies. A professional fighter, a combat artist, could be defeated by a cantina brawler who knew nothing about form, but everything about ending a conflict quickly, without a thought to winning gracefully or elegantly. Enslavement to form opened one to defeat by the unforeseen. This was often the failing of trained duelists, and it would be the failing of the Jedi Order. Given that elegance, gallantry, and enchantment were gone from the galaxy, it was only fitting that the Order's days were numbered, that the fire that had been the Jedi was guttering and dying out. As with the corrupt Republic itself, the Order's time had come. The noble Jedi, bound to the Force, sworn to uphold peace and justice, were seldom seen as heroes or saviors any longer, but more often as bullies or mobsters. Still, it was sad that it had fallen to Dooku to help usher them out. The conversation he had had with Yoda on dreary Vizhun was never far from his thoughts these days. For all his flair with words, all his Force-given personal power, Yoda was nothing more than an old one, unwilling to embrace anything new, indisposed to see any way but his own. Yet how terrible not simply to fade away, but to expire in full knowledge that the galaxy had tipped inexorably and at long last to the dark side, to the Sith, and might remain so for as long as the Jedi themselves had ruled. The unforeseen. Grievous and his guards were dancing, going through their program motions. An Ataro attack, answered by Shi-Cho, Suresu, answered by Loose Ma. Dooku couldn't suffer another moment of it. "No, no, stop, stop," he yelled, coming to his feet and striding to the middle of the training circle, his arms extended to both sides. When he was certain he had their attention, he swung to Grievous. "Power moves served you well on Hapori against Jedi such as Dakman Barak and Tar Seer, but I pity you should you have to face off against any of the Council Masters." He called into his hand his courtly, curved-handled lightsaber and drew a rapid X in the air, a Makashi flourish. "Do I need to demonstrate what responses you can expect from Sin Dralik or Obi-Wan Kenobi? From Mace Windu or Stars Help You, Yoda?" He flicked his blade quickly, ridding 2 of the guards of their staffs, then placing the glowing tip a millimeter from Grievous's death-helmeted visage. "Finesse, artfulness, economy. Otherwise, my friend, I fear you will end up beyond the repair of even the Geonosians. Do you take my meaning?" His vertically slit eyes unfathomable, Grievous nodded. I take your meaning, my lord. Dooku withdrew his blade. Again, then, with some measure of polish if I'm not asking for too much. Dooku seated himself and watched them go at it. Hopeless, he thought. But he knew that he was partly to blame. He had made the same mistake with Grievous that he had made with Ventress, by allowing her to fill herself with hate, as if hate could substitute for dispassion. Even the most hateful could be defeated, even the most angry. There should be no emotion in killing, no self, only the act. When he should have been helping Ventress rid herself of self, he had instead permitted her to grow impassioned. Sidious had once confessed that he had erred similarly in his training of Darth Maul. Ventress and Maul had been driven by a desire to excel, to be the best, instead of merely allowing themselves to be pure instruments of the dark side. The Jedi knew this about the Force, that the best of them were nothing more than instruments. Dooku grew troubled. Was Sidious thinking the same of him now? Thinking, this is where I failed poor Dooku, pitiful creature. It was entirely possible, considering how wrong things had gone on Naos 3. Standard days earlier, Dooku had sent Sidious a coded transmission that was as much apology as explanation, and had yet to hear from him. He watched Grievous disarm 2 of the Magna Guards. In fact, Grievous was all instrument. And Dooku, what was Count Dooku of Sereno? He glanced at the Hold's holoprojector table a moment before a blue hollow image of Sidious appeared above it. My time is at hand, he told himself as he centered himself proudly on the transmission grid, Grievous behind him, down on one knee, with head lowered. My lord, he said, bowing slightly at the waist, I've been waiting. There have been matters that warranted my close attention, Lord Tyrannus. Born, no doubt, of my failure at Naos 3, the ones I had sent had every opportunity to kill Kenobi, Skywalker, and the Twi'lek pilot. Instead, they decided to attempt their capture, to extract additional funds from me, as well as to bolster their reputations. Sidious was dismissive. Such is the way of bounty hunters. I should have foreseen this. Dooku blinked. Was this an admission of failure on Sidious's part? Was Sidious's upper lip twitching, or was it nothing more than noise in the transmission? The Force is strong in Skywalker, Sidious went on. Yes, my lord, very strong. Next time I will deal with the Jedi personally. Yes, that time is drawing near, Lord Tyrannus. But first we need to provide the Jedi with something that distracts them from hunting me. Sidious's upper lip was definitely twitching. Was this worry? Worry from someone fond of saying that things were going precisely as planned? What has happened, my lord? The Twi'lek's information led them to our rendezvous on Coruscant, Sidious said in a scurrilous voice. Dooku was stunned. Is there a greater danger? They think they have my scent, Lord Tyrannus, and perhaps they do. Can you leave Coruscant, my lord? From parsecs distant, Sidious stared at him. Leave Coruscant? For a time, my lord. Surely we can find some way. Sidious fell silent for a long moment, then said, Perhaps, Lord Tyrannus, perhaps. If not, then I will come to you. Sidious shook his head. That won't be necessary. I told you that their search for me would benefit us before too long, and thanks to you, I begin to see a way. What is thy bidding, master? Grievous asked from behind Dooku. Sidious turned slightly toward Grievous, but continued to speak to Dooku. The Jedi have divided their forces. We must do the same. I will deal with the ones on Coruscant. I need you to deal with the rest. My fleet stands ready, master, Grievous said, still without raising his gaze from the grid. The Republic is monitoring you? Sidious asked the general. Yes, master. Can you divide the fleet judiciously? It can be done, master. Good, good. Then move however many ships are needed to crush and occupy Typh. Again, Dooku was stunned. So too was Grievous. Is that wise, master? The general asked carefully, after what happened at Balderron. Sidious adopted a faint grin. More than wise, general. Inspired. But Typh, my lord, Dooku said with equal care. Less a world than a corpse. It has some strategic value, does it not, general? As a jump point, master, but a dubious prize regardless, when far better targets exist. It may prove costly to us, my lord. The Republic will almost certainly flatten it, Dooku said. Not if the Jedi are convinced that it must be retaken rather than destroyed. Confusion wrinkled Dooku's forehead. How will we convince them? We won't have to, Lord Tyrannus. Their own investigations will lead them to that conclusion. Moreover, Kenobi and Skywalker will oversee the counterattack. Indeed, my lord? They will not pass up an opportunity to capture Count Dooku. Dooku saw Grievous's armor-plast head elevate in surprise. What leads you to believe that the Republic will not simply flatten me at this point? The Jedi are predictable, Lord Tyrannus. I needn't tell you this. Look what they risked at Cata Nemoidia in an effort to capture Viceroy Gunray. They are obsessed with bringing their enemies to justice, instead of merely administering justice themselves. It is their way. Then you don't mind serving as bait to lure them there? Dooku inclined his head. As ever, I'm at your disposal, my lord. Sidious grinned once more. Hold Kenobi and Skywalker, Lord Tyrannus. Entertain them. Play to their weakness. Demonstrate your mastery, as you have on previous occasions. Grievous made a meaningful sound. I will do the same with their warships, Master. No, General, Sidious cut in. I have something else in mind for you and the rest of the fleet. But tell me, can you tuck your charges somewhere safe for the time being? The planet Utapau comes to mind, Lord Sidious. I will leave that to you. And when I have seen to that, Master? General, I'm certain you recall the plans we discussed some time ago regarding the final stage of the war. Regarding Coruscant. Regarding Coruscant, yes. Sidious paused and said, We must accelerate those plans. Prepare, General, for what will be your finest hour. Chapter 33. Fal-El is doing fine, Anakin said as he approached Obi-Wan jauntily. 2 more days at Bacta and she'll be on her feet. She says she's through with Now's 3, though. She might even remain here on Balderron. Obi-Wan looked at him askance. Your relationship with females is an interesting one. The more jeopardy they're in, the more you worry about them. And the more you worry about them, the more they worry about you. Anakin frowned. You're basing this on what exactly? Obi-Wan looked away. HoloNet gossip. Anakin stepped deliberately into Obi-Wan's gaze. Something's wrong. What is it? Obi-Wan sighed. We won't be returning to Coruscant. They were in a visitor's lounge on the largest of the Medstars orbiting Belderon. For 4 standard days they had been awaiting instructions from the Jedi Council and visiting the medical ward to check on Fal-El's progress, and the strain of so much inactivity was beginning to show. Anakin was staring dumbfounded at Obi-Wan. Hear me out before you go critical. Mace and Shaak Ti were able to locate the building in the works. Not surprisingly, it turns out to have been the same one where Quinlan Voss met with Dooku last year. Once inside, Mace's team discovered more than we could have even hoped for. Evidence of a more recent visit by Dooku, and of the person he apparently went to Coruscant to see. Sidious? Possibly. Even if it wasn't, it's likely that Dooku has other Confederates on Coruscant, and tracking them down could eventually lead us to Sidious. Other evidence has come to light as well. Intelligence discovered that the building belonged to a corporation called Limerge Power, which was believed to have been involved in the manufacture and distribution of prohibited weapons during Phineas Valorum's term as Supreme Chancellor. It was rumored at the time that Limerge was responsible for funding acts of piracy directed against Trade Federation vessels in the Outer Rim, and it was those acts of piracy that led ultimately to the Trade Federation being granted the right to defend their vessels with battle droids. Are you telling me that Limerge might have been in league with the Sith? Why not? At Naboo, the Trade Federation was in league with Sidious. The entire Confederacy is in league with him now. Anakin shrugged impatiently. I still don't understand how this keeps us from returning to Coruscant. I've just been informed that the Separatists have attacked a Republic garrison base on Tyth and occupied the planet. Who cares? I mean, I'm sorry for any troopers we lost, but Tyth is a wasteland. Exactly, Obi-Wan said, but before it became a wasteland, it was headquarters for Limerge Power. Anakin mulled it over for a moment. Another attempt by Sidious to erase the trail we've been following? Obi-Wan ran his hand over his mouth. The Council was able to convince Palpatine of the need to retake Tyth, and he's authorized a full battle group to divert there. It seems he's finally willing to follow Master Yoda's advice about concentrating and dismantling the Confederacy leadership. Grievous is on Tyth? Obi-Wan grinned. Better. Dooku is there. Anakin turned his back to Obi-Wan. His face was flushed when he finally swung around. Not good enough. Obi-Wan blinked. Not good enough? The search for Sidious began with us. We discovered the first clues. If he's thought to be on Coruscant, then we're the ones who should be there to capture him. Anakin, Mace and Shaak Ti are more than capable of seeing to that, if Sidious is even there. Anakin was shaking his head. Not as easily as we could. Sidious is a Sith Lord. Obi-Wan took a moment to respond. The way I remember it, we didn't fare all that well against Dooku. All that's changed, Anakin said, becoming angrier as he spoke. I'm stronger than I was. You're stronger. Together we can defeat any Sith. Anakin, is this really about capturing Sidious? Of course it is. We deserve the honor. Honor? Since when did this war become a contest for first place? If you're thinking that the capture of Sidious will earn you a place on the Council... I don't care about the Council. I'm telling you we need to return to Coruscant. People are counting on us. What people? The people of Coruscant. Obi-Wan inhaled slowly. Why don't I believe you? I don't know, Master. Suppose you tell me. Obi-Wan narrowed his eyes. Don't turn this into a game. There's something else at work here. Have you had a vision I should know about? Anakin started to reply, bit back whatever it was he had in mind to say, and began again. The truth is, I want to be home. We've been out here longer than anyone, trooper or Jedi. That's what you get for being so good at what you do, Obi-Wan said, hoping to lighten the mood. I'm tired of it, Master. I want to be home. Obi-Wan studied him. You miss the temple so much? The food? The lights of Coruscant? Yes. Yes to what? All of it. Then your protests have nothing to do with capturing Sidious? No, they do. Well, which is it? Home or Sidious? Why can't it be both? Obi-Wan fell silent, as if struck by a sudden suspicion. Anakin, is it Padme? Anakin rolled his eyes. Here you go again. Well, is it? Anakin compressed his lips and said, I won't lie to you and say I don't miss her. Obi-Wan frowned sympathetically. You can't afford to miss her in that way. And exactly why is that, Master? Because you cannot be married to both. Who said anything about marriage? She's a friend. I miss her as a friend. You would forego your destiny for Padme? Anakin's brows beetled in anger. I never claimed to be the chosen one. That was Qui-Gon. Even the Council doesn't believe it anymore, so why should you? Because I think you believe it, Obi-Wan said calmly. I think you know in your heart that you're meant for something extraordinary. And you, Master? What does your heart tell you you're meant for? Infinite sadness, Obi-Wan said, even while smiling. Anakin regarded him. If you believe in destiny, then everything we do becomes part of that destiny, whether we go to Tyth or we return to Coruscant. You may be right. I don't have the answer. I wish I did. Then where does that leave us? Obi-Wan rested his hands on Anakin's shoulders. Speak with Palpatine. Maybe he'll see something in this that I've missed. Chapter 34. 50 meters ahead of Mace in the tunnel, Shaak Ti held up her hand, motioning for him to stop. Angling his purple blade to the floor, Mace turned to relay the signal to the commandos behind him. Shaak Ti's whisper reached him through the Force. Movement ahead. She gestured to the mouth of an intersecting tunnel just beyond where she stood, her profile limed blue by the glow of her raised lightsaber. Faint light spilled from the opening, as if someone with a handheld luma was approaching on foot. Mace waved a signal to Commander Valiant, whose team moved forward stealthily, hugging the walls, their T-visor helmets allowing them to see in the dark. Normally the probe droids would have had the point, playing their lights and sensors across the dusty floor and tiled walls, sending data to Dine and his team of analysts. Mace and Shaak Ti would ride in separate speeders behind the agents, intermingled with those of the commandos. Occasionally, however, the Jedi would assume the lead on foot for a couple of kilometers, usually in response to some anomaly discovered by the droids. Ventilation, such as it was, came courtesy of ancient blowers that did little more than drag in the sooty air from above, and illumination was provided by what the team brought with them. They were deep below an area of the works called the Grungian Block. Encompassing 20 square kilometers, the block had originally been a production center for servo droid, Huvico, and Nebula manufacturing, but it had fallen on hard times when its three principal clients had declared bankruptcy. Unable to attract new businesses, the developers who owned the Grungian had allowed Strats and other vermin to overrun the stamping plants and cashed out. In the days since the raid, Mace's team had searched nearly every nook and cranny of the confusion of tunnels and shafts that undermined the Grungian in similar assembly areas. 10 kilometers into the tunnel that led to the merge building's sub-basement, a shaft had been found, leading to a deeper, older tunnel that also ran east toward the Senate District. In appearance, the parallel tunnels were similar, save for the fact that the floor of the older one hosted an ancient maglev rail. The probe droids had discovered places along the rail where the accumulated decades of dust and debris had been blown away by the rapid passage of a repulsor lift vehicle of some sort. With no other clues to go on, the team made the mag-level tunnel the focus of the investigation. Still, Mace felt that the team was on the right track. An extensive search of the Lemerge building had revealed the remains of several Trang Robotics Duelist elite droids that had been reduced to Durasteel pieces by a lightsaber. Only Sidious, Dooku, or Sidious's previous apprentice could have performed the amputations. And there was more. Shortly before Dooku had left the Jedi Order to return to his native Sereno, during the period when he had taken the title Count and had first gone public with his discontents about the Republic, he had been known to frequent a tavern called the Golden Cuff, which had been a watering hole for senators, lobbyists, and aides. Analysts at the temple were going through files of security cam holo images 13 years old, hoping to find images of Dooku and anyone he may have met with repeatedly. Thus far, no images of Dooku had surfaced in the recordings that had survived. Even if images of Dooku's tavern mates did surface, the Jedi had no means of identifying any of them as Darth Sidious, but the images could provide an additional starting point for further investigation. By now, Mace could hear movement and soft voices ahead. Hardly a good tactic for hostiles intent on springing an ambush, but one never knew. He stretched out with his feelings, alert for diversions or clues he might have overlooked, obscured by the dark side or owing to his own neglect. Standing nearby, Valiant looked to Mace for the go signal. When Mace nodded, Valiant said, "Light it up!" Weapons raised, gas and fragmentation grenades enabled, the commandos sprinted into the intersecting tunnel, firing tracer bolts into the gloom. Tied on their heels, Mace heard Valiant yell, "Down on the floor! Don't move! I said don't move!" More fire erupted, then several commando voices were shooting, "Stay still! Down on your faces! Hands up! All 4 of them!" All 4 of them? Mace thought. Edging through the commandos, he reached Valiant, whose blast tech was aimed at a cowering crowd of 30 or so 4-armed insectoid aliens who were babbling in some language other than basic, or speaking it with an accent so thick as to make their words unintelligible. "Lower your weapons," Mace told the commandos, "and someone bring that interpreter droid forward." Mace's command was relayed down the line, and a moment later a highly polished silver protocol droid tottered into the tunnel, muttering to itself. "I don't understand how I've gone from serving the Separatists to serving the Republic. Did I undergo a partial memory wipe?" "Consider yourself lucky," one of the commandos said. "Now you're on the side of the good guys." "Good guys, bad guys, who can tell any more? What's more, you won't be so quick to say that should someone compel you to shift loyalties at a moment's notice." "Droid!" Mace shouted. "I do have a name, sir." Mace glanced at Valiant. "TC or something or other," the ARC said. "Fine," Mace said, grabbing hold of TC-16 and pointing him in the direction of the terrified aliens. "See if you can make sense of what these folk are saying." The droid listened to the babbling, responded in kind, and turned to face Mace. "They're Unats, General, speaking their native language, which is called Un." Mace regarded the huddled, shivering group. "What are they doing down here?" TC-16 listened, then said, They say they haven't the slightest idea where they are, General. They arrived on Coruscant in a shipping container that was airdropped at a decrepit landing platform some 20 kilometers from here. The personage who was to have guided them into the depths of the Screw sector stole all their credits and abandoned them in the works. Undocumented refugees, Valiant said. Mace frowned. The tunnels beneath the Grungian block held countless surprises. They almost got themselves killed. Apparently that's nothing new for them, TC-16 said. Their planet fell to the Separatists. The freighter they originally took passage on was attacked by pirates. Several of them. That's enough, Mace said. Assure them that they're not going to be harmed, and that we'll see to it they reach a refugee camp. He nodded to Valiant, who in turn told two of his troopers to carry out Mace's command. Talk about your corridor, ghouls, Dine said, eyeing the aliens as he approached Mace. Squatters, death stick runners, lost droids, now undocumented refugees. Next it'll be Sathons, Dine said, referring to the flesh-eating humanoids believed by many Coruscanti to inhabit the world's underground. Shakti joined them. These corridors are highways for people who want to enter central Coruscant illegally. Dine sighed in disappointment. Our chances for picking up Sidious's trail decrease with each person who passes. How far are we from the Senate District? Shakti asked. Within a couple of kilometers, Dine said. We might think about going directly to the buildings Lemerge Power once owned in the city core, and see if we can't work our way toward the works from those. Mace considered the idea, then shook his head. Not yet. Mace waved everyone back into motion, then fell into step with Shakti. Wild gun, Dark Chase? She nodded. Only because our quarry is aware that we're closing in on him. He failed to silence the ones Obi-Wan and Anakin searched out, and by now he knows that we've discovered his and Dooku's den. It's unlikely he will wait around for us to surprise him. That's true, but there's much to gain from simply identifying him. If not here, then by means of something Obi-Wan and Anakin discover on Tyth. Assuming there's anything left after Dooku sterilizes the place. From everything we've seen, Sidious and Dooku don't make many mistakes. They walked in silence for a long while. They were a kilometer closer to the outlying areas of the Senate District when Dine called to them from behind. Mace saw that the intelligence analysts and commandos were gathered some 20 meters away. He and Shakti had been so engrossed in their private thoughts that neither of them had noticed the probe droid stopping to investigate something. Joining the others, the Jedi watched the droids hover with clear purpose in front of a large niche in the tunnel wall. Dine's handheld sensor needed only a moment to discover a small control panel that operated the niche's sliding door. The door concealed the entrance to a narrow, dimly lit corridor, and all but hiding in plain sight a repulsor lift speeder bike, semicircular in design, with an arc of concentric seat and a single steering handle. Mace and Shakti traded astonished looks. How did we miss seeing this? She asked. Mace's brow furrowed. The answer is in the question. Chapter 35. As big as life, Palpatine's hollow image spoke from atop a projector table in a private comlink lounge aboard the medical frigate. With R2-D2 standing off to one side of the transmission grid, Anakin hung on the Supreme Chancellor's every word. Of course the Council doesn't understand, Palpatine said. Surely you don't find that surprising. They reject every suggestion I make. On principle, I'm beginning to think. It's obvious that you're upset, Anakin, but you must be patient. Your time will come. When, sir? Palpatine smiled lightly. I can't see into the future, my boy. Anakin's face contorted. What if I told you that I could? I would believe you, Palpatine said without pause. Tell me what you see. Coruscant. Are we in danger? I'm not certain. I just feel that I need to be there. Palpatine gazed away from the holocam. I suppose I could invent some pretexts. His gaze returned to Anakin. But is that wise? I'm not the wise one. Ask anybody. What does Master Kenobi say? He's the one who suggested I contact you, Anakin said sharply. Really? But what does he think you should do? Anakin blew out his breath. Obi-Wan is under the illusion that I can't deny my destiny, no matter what I do. Your former master is wiser than you think, Anakin. Yes, and he's the only Jedi in 1,000 years to have killed the Sith. Palpatine spread his hands. That alone has to count for something, though I'm at a loss to know precisely what. Obi-Wan is wise, but he has no heart, sir. He sees everything in terms of the Force. If you want advice about the Force, you must look to him, because I am of no help. That's exactly what I don't want. I live in the Force, but I also live in the real world. I came from the real world. Just as you said, I had the advantage of a normal childhood. Well, sort of. Palpatine waited until he was certain Anakin was finished. My boy, I don't know that it's healthy to have a foot in each world. Soon you may have to make a choice. Anakin nodded. I'm ready. Palpatine smiled again. But back to the matter at hand. It sounds to me as if the recapture of Tyth could prove very important toward ending the war. I don't understand all of it. The Jedi Council's being very secretive with me. Anakin fought the temptation to reveal everything about the search for Darth Sidious. He glanced at R2-D2 as expecting commiseration, but the astromech only swiveled his dome, his processor status indicator flashing from blue to red. Finally, Anakin said, I don't know what to do, sir. Palpatine adopted a sympathetic expression. It's decided. I shall prevail upon the Council to order you back to the core. No one needs further proof of how intrepid you are, or how committed you are to defeating our enemies. In time you will learn to trust your feelings. Then you'll be invincible. Palpatine's advice to him 3 years earlier. No, Anakin said in a rush. No. Thank you, sir, but I'm needed on Tyth. Dooku is there. I'm sorry, Padme. I'm so sorry. I miss you so much. Yes, Palpatine was saying. Dooku is the key to everything just now. Despite all our victories in the inner systems. Do you suspect he and General Grievous may have some secret strategy? If they do, Obi-Wan and I will defeat them before they can implement it. The Republic counts on it. Safeguard Coruscant, sir. Safeguard everyone there. I will, my boy, and rest assured that I will call on you if I need you. Obi-Wan was in Medstar's docking bay, waiting for the shuttle that would take him to the light cruiser Integrity. His arms were folded across his chest, and a small rucksack was sitting on the deck. Did you get through to him? He asked as Anakin and R2-D2 approached. Well, I spoke to him. That's what I meant. And? Anakin averted his gaze. We both decided that my place is here, Master. He sounded on the verge of tears. Obi-Wan merely nodded. For a moment I thought you were going to leave it to me to retake Tyth. Anakin looked at him. I know better than that. You don't think I'm capable? Obi-Wan asked, around a forming grin. I know you'd be willing to die trying. There is no trying. Yes, there is. Anakin cut him off, and you're living proof of it. Obi-Wan smiled, then glanced out the hold's MagCon transparency. The shuttle's coming. Anakin's eyes tracked the approaching light. I'm as ready as I'll ever be. He still wasn't smiling. Obi-Wan closed his hand around Anakin's upper right arm. Anakin, let's get Dooku and end this. Anakin swallowed and nodded. If it's meant to be, Master. Chapter 36. With assistance from the probe droids, the discolored panels at the end of the corridor unlocked and parted. Brown robes swirling behind him and lightsaber in hand, Mace barreled through the doorway with Shaak Ti and the commandos close behind. By rote, the troopers spread out, quickly and efficiently, but also unnecessarily. Surprise, Shaak Ti said flatly. Another corridor. Another corridor closer, Mace said, determined to put a good spin on it. The tunnel the team had followed from the hidden niche had led them through a maze of twists, turns, forks, steep climbs, and sudden drops. For stretches, the dark corridor had been wide enough to contain a speeder. Then it grew so narrow that everyone had had to edge through. For 2 kilometers, walls, ceiling, and floor were damp from water that had trickled down through Coruscant's layered surface. There, the prints of their prey had disappeared, but the probe droids had managed to pick up the trail farther along. Some of the prints were so recent and well-preserved that Dine had been able to calculate the human's slipper size. Human. That much the droids had determined from smudged fingerprints found on the speeder bike's steering grip and cushioned seat. The repulsor lift machine had also provided the droids with fibers, hairs, and other detritus. Slowly, a portrait of Dooku's unknown confederate was being compiled. His eyes fixed on the display screen of his data processor, Captain Dine ambled toward Mace and Shaak Ti. Master Jedi, our search is about to take us to a whole new level. Mace looked around the tunnel for signs of a concealed turbo lift or staircase. Up or down? Shaak Ti asked, equally bewildered. Dine glanced up, blinking at her. I didn't mean new level in the literal sense. He indicated the hovering probe droids, which were eager to have the team follow them east. If the prints lead us far enough, we're going to end up in the sub-basements of 500 Republica. Mace tracked the droids as they moved deeper into the corridor. 500 Republica, home to thousands of Coruscant's wealthiest senators, celebrities, shipping magnates, and media tycoons. And one of them, very possibly, a Sith Lord. Chapter 37. There was little the Confederacy or the Republic could add to the damage Limerge power had inflicted on Tyth generations earlier. From deep space, the surface, glimpsed through a pall of ash-gray clouds, looked as if it had been licked by a flare from its primary, or had had a brush with an enormous meteor. But Tyth's scars owed to none of that. The planet had been spared everything but Limerge itself, whose attempts to exploit Tyth's abundant deposits of natural plasma had invoked a cataclysm of global proportions. The three drifting hulks that had been the Republic cruisers might have been caught up in the cataclysm, but were in fact casualties of the Separatist attack, which had come swiftly and without quarter. Nimbused by what vacuum had drawn from their interiors, the scorched and lanced trio lazed midway between opposing battle groups of Separatist and Republic vessels. Just once I wish we could repay Dooku and Grievous in kind, Anakin said over the tactical net as Red Squadron dropped from the belly of the Integrity and rocked toward Tyth. The fact that we don't is what keeps us centered in the Force, Obi-Wan said. Anakin grunted. There'll come a time when they'll have to answer to us personally, and it'll be the Force that guides our blades. The two starfighters were flying abreast, almost wingtip to wingtip, astromech droids R2-D2 and R4-P17 in their respective sockets. Tyth's Rubicon star was at their backs, and the ships that made up the Separatist flotilla were strung menacingly above the planet's northern hemisphere. With Tyth's brood of moons clustered in a 200-degree arc, the Separatists had worked quickly to strew mines at several hyperspace jump points, leaving the Republic ships with only a narrow window in which to revert to real space. Trade Federation, Techno Union, and Commerce Guild capital ships occupied the apex of that window, deployed from North Pole to equator above Tyth's bright side, with wings of droid fighters boiling into space to the fore of the arrayed vessels. To minimize their profiles, the Republic ships, widely dispositioned, like a group of predatory fish, had their triangular bows pointed toward the planet. Red and other squadrons were streaking forward, but well short of engaging the vanguard vultures and tri-fighters. Prepare to brake hard to starboard, Anakin said over the net to the entire squadron. Watch your countdown displays. On my mark, 10 seconds to brake. Obi-Wan kept his eyes on the counter at the bottom of the instrument panel's tactical display screen. At the 0 mark, he yanked the yoke to one side and peeled away for clear space. Behind the squadrons of V-Wings and Jedi and ARC-170 starfighters, the Republic battle group broke to port, drenching the Separatist ships with furious broadsides. Blinding payloads of spun plasma hurtled through space, detonating against the shields of the enemy vessels, atomizing any droid fighters unlucky enough to have been caught in the way. The Separatist ships absorbed the first hits without flinching. Vessels that sustained damage began to drift to the rear. Then the battle group responded with an equally ferocious barrage. Turbo lasers silenced, the Republic ships had already broken formation. Small suns flared in their midst, and blue energy capered over their shield hulls. No sooner did the barrage end than the squadrons regrouped, accelerating an effort to reach the big enemy ships before their cannons or shields could repower. The droid fighters swooped in to meet them halfway, and the tight formations observed by both sides dissolved into dozens of separate skirmishes. Those Republic starfighters that managed to steal through the chaos drew into tight clusters and continued their fiery advance. The rest became embroiled in swift attacks and evasive maneuvers. Local space became a scrawl of scarlet lines and white spirals, punctuated by expanding explosions. Craft of both camps came apart, tumbling and spinning from the arena, wingless or in flames. "They're being shot to pieces," Red 7 said over the net. "They know their job," Anakin responded. That job was to buy Red Squadron enough time to skirt the main action and race down Tyth's gravity well. A burst transmission from survivors of the assault on the Republic's small base had confirmed Dooku's presence on the surface. But on the possibility that Tyth was a calculated diversion, Palpatine's naval command staff had agreed to committing only a single battle group from the Outer Rim fleet. In the view of those same naval commanders, invasion was senseless, a base Delta Zero attack justified. In the end, it was decided that saturation bombardment, augmented by limited starfighter engagement, would send Dooku fleeing, in keeping with the Republic's strategy to force the Separatists deeper into the galaxy's spiral arms. The Jedi had insisted, nevertheless, that an attempt be made to take Dooku alive. Obi-Wan and Anakin didn't need to be reminded of what had happened only weeks earlier in Cad and Nemoidia when they had gone after Viceroy Gunray, but they were not about to forego a chance to capture the Sith Lord. Red Squadron's intended insertion point was 20 degrees south of Tyth's North Pole, where the Separatist line was almost dispersed. With droid fighters still pouring from the curving arms of Trade Federation Lucrehulks, and the recoiling barrels of Commerce Guild cannons filling local space with storms of unleashed energy, Anakin led the starfighters on a weaving course through the heart of the enemy fleet. "No signature for Grievous's cruiser," he said to Obi-Wan. "None of the ships of the Separatist leadership are here." Obi-Wan glanced at the wireframe display of his threat assessment screen. All the more reason to believe that Dooku was ordered here by Sidious. Then where's everyone else? Obi-Wan was troubled by the thought, but didn't admit to it. "Dooku will know," he started to say, when the starfighter's proximity scanner stammered a warning. "Techno-Union starship is veering to intercept us." "Droid fighters are away and locking on," Red 3 added. Obi-Wan acknowledged. "Angle shields. We can outfly them." "We'll end up too far off course," Anakin said. "We're almost at the insertion point," Obi-Wan said. "That starship isn't just going to move aside. Form up on me. We'll show 'em how we improvise." There was no time to argue the point. Rolling to port, Obi-Wan fell in behind Anakin and fired his thrusters. Trailing behind, Red Squadron accelerated and banked for the narrow-waisted vessel. "Ready proton torpedoes," Anakin said. "Sow them just above the fuel cells." Point-defense turbolasers sought the starfighters as they fell on the ship, needling space with outpourings of gaudy energy. Corkscrewing missiles claimed Red 10 and Red 12, both of which disappeared in angry blossoms of fire. Sensing its sudden vulnerability, the huge vessel launched additional droid fighters. In the instant it lowered its shields to route power to the sublight drives, Red Squadron attacked. Tied on Anakin, the 10 remaining starfighters yawed for the waist of the ship, just forward of its cluster of cylindrical fuel cells. Dropping his craft to within 100 meters of the pinched hull, Anakin began to hug the surface, surging onto a course that would whip Red Squadron through a tight circle around the forward ends of the fuel cells. "Torpedoes away," he said at the halfway mark. Obi-Wan triggered the launchers and watched 2 torpedoes burn toward the target. Behind him, the rest of Red Squadron did the same. Hits began to score, fire and gas fountaining from breaches in the ship's dark hull. The disabling run completed, Anakin boosted for Tyth. "She's finished!" In single file, Red Squadron followed. Almost instantly, the punctured vessel exploded, stunning the fleeing starfighters with a wave of force. Red 9 disappeared at the edge of the roiling detonation zone, and Red 7 wheeled off into the void with both wings sheared away. Obi-Wan regained control of his craft and once more attached himself to Anakin 6. "Insertion points in 15 seconds, Anakin updated. "Dial inertial compensators to maximum. All power to the ablative shields. Deceleration burn on my mark." Obi-Wan clamped his hands on the violently shaking yoke as Red Squadron ripped into Tyth's plundered atmosphere. He thought his teeth might rattle out of his jaws and drop into his lap. Eyes and ears might implode from the pressure. Chest might cave in and crush his heart. Light flashed behind him, streaked past the cockpit. Half a dozen droid fighters were chasing them down the well. Not having to concern themselves with endangering living systems, the vultures should have been able to descend even more rapidly and more acutely than the starfighters. But as the heat of entry built in the ships, survival protocols began to kick in, tasking the fighters to adjust the angle of their descents. For some of the droids, it was already too late. Single contrails became particle showers as gravity summoned the broken fighters to their doom. Punching through the blankets of clouds at suicidal velocity, Obi-Wan's starfighter went into a roll. Pinwheeling before his eyes, Tyth was a kaleidoscopic furor of white and brown, smeared occasionally with striations of blue-green. Anakin's voice grew loud in his ears. "Nose up! Nose up!" With effort, Obi-Wan leveled out of his plummet, his stomach lurching up into his throat. Reaching forward, he engaged the starfighter's topographic sensors. The ship was dropping toward ice floes and bergs. Then far below, peninsulas of rocky islands came into view. The surging waves of a dead gray ocean, the denuded shelf of a continent, barren land fissured by dry, sinuous riverbeds, and mounded by brown hills strewn with toppled trees. A ruined world. "Head count," he said into his helmet microphone. 5 voices responded. Red's 8 and 11 were lost. "Locking in target coordinates," Anakin said. Red's squadron flew just above the contours of land that had once been as lush as the areas surrounding Theed and Naboo. Now a desert, save for areas where exotic species of vegetation thrived in lakes of red-brown water, their jagged shorelines crusted yellow and black. Also like Naboo, Tyth had once mined plasma in sufficient quantities to ship off-world, but greed had driven Lemurge Power to experiment with dangerous methods for keeping the ionized gas under adequate heat. A chain reaction set in motion by nuclear fuels had destroyed facilities throughout Tyth's northern hemisphere and had left the planet uninhabitable for a generation. "Target facilities 10 kilometers west," Anakin said. "We should be hearing from artillery soon enough." Soaring from the edge of a high plateau, the 6 starfighters dropped into a broad valley, disturbingly reminiscent of Geonosis, right down to the berth starships and war machines spread across the floor. Hailfire droids wheeled out to greet them with volleys of surface-to-air missiles. Turbo-laser cannons affixed to Trade Federation landing ships cut the gray-yellow sky to ribbons. Staps lifted into the air and squads of infantry droids hurried for armed skimmers. Unequipped to defend itself against the onslaught, tattered Red Squadron banked broadly to the north, evading plasma beams and flak from exploding heat seekers. Anakin and Obi-Wan paid out the last of their proton torpedoes in futile attempts to save Reds 3, 4, and 5. Bursts from their laser cannons crippled 2 enemy speeders and countless droid fighters, sending them crashing into the contaminated terrain. R4 P-17 howled as Obi-Wan twisted the starfighter through violent airbursts and superheated clouds of billowing smoke. Red 6 vanished. When they had juked their way through the worst of it, Anakin came alongside Obi-Wan. It was just the 2 of them now. ".30," Anakin said, "on the landing platform." Obi-Wan gazed out the right side of the cockpit at what had been an enormous plasma-generating facility. Fractured containment domes and adjacent roofless structures revealed toppled extraction shafts, exploded activators, and tumbled walkways. In the center of the complex stood an elevated square of corroded ferrocrete, crowded with enemy fighter craft and bearing a single Geonosian fantail of a distinctive design. Dooku's sloop. The words had scarcely left Obi-Wan's mouth when battle droids began to gush from the facility and out onto the landing platform. Bolts from the droids' blasters clawed at the pair of prowling starfighters. "I guess we're not going in through the front door," Obi-Wan said. "There's another way," Anakin said as they were emerging from their flyby. "We go in through the North Dome." Obi-Wan looked over his left shoulder at the partially collapsed hemisphere. The lid that had once topped the plasma containment structure was long gone, and the resultant circular opening was large enough for a starfighter to thread. Obi-Wan had misgivings, nevertheless. "What about residual radiation inside the dome?" "Radiation?" Anakin laughed. "The maneuver alone will probably kill us." Chapter 38. With its 53 skydocks, hundreds of private turbolifts, arrays of hidden security armaments, and towering atria, 500 Republica was a world unto itself. Containing more technology than many Outer Rim worlds and more residents than some, the sky-piercing structure was the unrivaled gem of the Senate District, and the elegant cynosure of the district's prestigious ambassadorial sector. What had begun as a stately building in the classic style had, over the course of centuries, become a veritable mountain of steps and setbacks, some with flat roofs, others as gently rounded as shoulders, and still others as massive as any structure in the district. Up and up they climbed, profuse, organic, in seeming competition for Coruscant's sunlight, culminating in a graceful crown, banded with penthouses and topped by a lithe spire. Gilded by the rising sun, its head in the clouds, buttressed by the towers that allowed it to outgrow all its neighbors, 500 Republica was the lofty vantage from which a privileged few could actually gaze down on Coruscant, which was precisely why the building had become the landmark the galaxy's disenfranchised pointed to when they spoke of Coruscant's disproportionate wealth and elitism. Why 500 Republica was viewed by many as more emblematic of the bloated, indulgent Senate than the Senate's own squat mushroom of a home. Mace could feel the oppressive weight of the structure bearing down on him as the team entered 500 Republica's Level 1 sub-basement. Square kilometers of supportive ferrocrete and durasteel, crammed with whining, whirring machines that kept the tower stable, aloft, secure, climate-controlled, and supplied with water and power. As deep as it was, the sub-basement was still 100 meters above Coruscant's true underground, and twice that above the original surface of the planet. The team had had to wait hours for Republica security to grant them permission to enter and carry on with the investigation. For a time, Mace had considered appealing to Palpatine for permission, since the Supreme Chancellor had an upper-level suite in the building. For company, the probe droids had scores of custodial and maintenance droids, but the trail to Sidious had gone cold, lost among countless footprints that covered the floor. Unless we can find prints that say otherwise, there's no guarantee our quarry gained entrance to the sub-basement from 500 Republica itself, Dine pronounced, switching his handheld processor to standby mode. He may have entered from the tunnels that connect to the east or west skydocks. In other words, he could have arrived here from just about anywhere on Coruscant, Shakti said. Dine nodded. Presumably. Mace gazed down the tunnel the team had taken. Could we have missed something along the way? The droids wouldn't. Mace gestured to the smudged and stained ferrocrete floor. Why would the prince suddenly end right here? Dine compressed his lips and shook his head. Maybe someone carried him here by repulsor lift. Unless you're suggesting he levitated across the floor. He thought about it for a long moment, then said, All right, for the sake of argument, let's say that he did levitate here. There'll be prints at his starting point, Mace said. Dine scanned the sub-basement, pursed his lips, and blew out his breath. We're going to need a lot more probe droids. How many more? Mace asked. A lot. How long to bring them here and search this entire level? With all this machinery, the skydock access tunnels, the waste and supply turbolifts, I couldn't begin to guess. What's more, we're going to need additional security clearance to search the tunnels. You'll have whatever clearance you need, Shakti promised. Mace glanced around. You'll have to run imaging scans of the partitions and the exterior walls. That could require several weeks, Dine said cautiously. Then the sooner we begin, the better. Dine took a comlink from his belt and was about to activate it when the floor began to tremble. A quake? Mace asked Shakti. She shook her head. I'm not sure. A second jolt shook the sub-basement, strong enough to dust the team with loose ferrocrete from the high ceiling. Feels like something rammed the building, Dine said. It wouldn't be the first time an intoxicated or exhausted driver had veered from one of the free travel sky lanes and plowed into the side of a building, Mace told himself, and yet the next shudder was accompanied by the distant sound of a powerful explosion. Lights in the sub-basement faded momentarily, then returned to full illumination, sending the custodial and maintenance droids into frantic activity. Also, at a far remove, klaxons and sirens blared. My comlink isn't working, Dine said, jabbing at the device's frequency search control with his forefinger. We're tiers below mid-level, Shakti said. Dine shook his head. That shouldn't matter. Not in here. Stretching out with the force, Mace sensed danger, frenzy, pain, and death. Where's the nearest exit? Dine pointed to his left. The tunnel to the east skydock. Mace's thoughts swirled. He turned to Valiant. Commander, Shakti and I will need half your squad. You and the rest of your team will assist Captain Dine with the search. Keep me informed of your progress. What about me, sir? Mace looked at TC-16, then at Dine. The droid stays with you. Flanked by commandos, Mace and Shakti raced off. The tunnel to the east skydock shook as they hurried through mixed-species crowds of frightened pedestrians, heading toward and away from 500 Republica. Ahead of them loomed a square of dim sunlight, almost aquatic in quality, typical of the lower reaches of Coruscant's urban canyons. On the huge quadrilangular skydock, humans, humanoids, and aliens were crouched behind parked limos, taxis, and private yachts, or hurrying for the entrance to the upper-level maglev platform. Shouts and screams punctuated the drone of overhead traffic. Panic gripped the free travel sky lanes. Taxis and transports were swerving in all directions, careening into one another in the sides of buildings, making desperate rooftop and plaza landings. Higher, a plunging vehicle, a boxy cargo ship engulfed in flames, came streaking through a horizontal auto-navigation lane, surrendering some of its velocity to a violent collision with a public transport pod before continuing its fiery plunge toward the bottom of the canyon. Mace tracked the ill-fated ship for a moment, then tilted his head back and put the edge of his hand to his brow. Distant buildings shimmered as if miraged by heat. The district's defensive shield has been raised. Higher still, something was wrong with the flickering sky. Light flared behind stratified clouds, and thunder of a kind reverberated from the summits of the taller buildings. Far to the south, Coruscant's pale blue mantle was hashed into triangles and slivers by white contrails. In their oblate pools of white skin, Shaak Ti's eyes were wide when she looked at Mace. "An attack," she said in stunned disbelief. Comlink ready in hand, Mace activated the Jedi Temple frequency and held the device to his ear. "Nothing but noise." "The deflector shield," Shaak Ti said. She craned her neck, striped montrails and headtail quivering. Or could they be jamming transmissions? Mace's nostrils flared. "Crowd control," he told the commandos. To Shaak Ti he said, "Find Palpatine. See to it he's conveyed to safety. I'll send backup." Chapter 39. In the ruined archive hall of Lemerge Power's plasma facility, Count Dooku waited for Kenobi and Skywalker to arrive. The room was enormous by any standard, 30 meters high and 3 times that in circumference. Dooku could imagine it when it had hummed with life and activity before the catastrophe. Still, that it had remained intact was a testament to its builders, and with its curved walls of hollow books and data storage disks, irradiated beyond salvage, he accepted that some might believe that secrets of the most sinister sort were concealed here. Jedi like Kenobi and Skywalker, who wanted to believe as much. Despite their gullibility, they were nothing if not tenacious and, dare he admit it, exceptional in the risks they undertook, and how deluded they were about so many things. In their unabashed zeal to capture him, they had actually piloted their starfighter straight through the roof of the largest of the facility's containment domes, and had managed to survive. Such superhuman feats were almost enough to convince Dooku that they still had the Force with them. If only they weren't so naive and easily manipulated. Once again, Darth Sidious had divined the actions they would take well in advance of their own deciding. The talent had less to do with being able to peer into the future than with having access to streams of possibilities. Sidious wasn't unerring. He could be surprised or taken off his guard, as at Geonosis, as in the case of Gunray's Mechno-Chair, but not for long. His mastery of the dark side of the Force endowed him with the power to decipher the currents that comprised the future, and to comprehend that while those currents were manifold, they were not boundless. Such mastery was one of the skills that distinguished Sidious from Yoda, who believed the future was so much in motion it could not be read with any clarity, especially during times when the dark side was on the ascendant. But how could Yoda be expected to see the whole picture with one eye closed? Deliberately closed. The Jedi accepted as a matter of faith that embracing the dark side meant cutting themselves off from the light, when in fact the dark side opened one to the full range of the Force. There was, after all, only the Force. It was unfortunate for the Jedi that they believed the Force was theirs alone to use in honor. That sense of entitlement was evident in the way Kenobi and Skywalker called on the Force in their fervor to confront him, opening doors with waves of their hands, clearing obstacles from their path with similar gestures, moving with what appeared to be numerous speed and agility, flourishing their blue blades as if they were powered by the will of the Force itself, while at the same time oblivious. Dooku took a moment to set in place his compact, welcoming device, then hurried through a series of decontamination chambers into the facility's control room, which overlooked the rear of the archive hall and the vast space enclosed by the containment dome itself. There he activated a second small holoprojector and positioned himself for the holocam. Owing to interference, images of the archive hall were nowhere near as clear as he might have wished, and the audio feed was worse. It was more important, though, that Kenobi and Skywalker be able to see him than he them. At long last, the two Jedi rushed headlong into the hall, only to stop upon spying his life-sized hollow image emanating from the compact holoprojector he had left behind. Dooku, young Skywalker said, as if his tone of voice should suffice to send shivers on the backbones of his opponents. Show yourself. Rooms distant, Dooku merely spread his hands in a gesture of greeting and aimed his words at the holoprojector's microphone. Stand not amazed, young Jedi. Is this not the way you had your first glimpse of Lord Sidious? Instead of replying, Kenobi touched Skywalker on the arm, and the two of them began to scan the hall, no doubt in an attempt to locate him through the Force. You won't find me, Jedi. We know you're here, Dooku, Kenobi said suddenly, and with some irksome audio distortion. We can sense you. Dooku sighed in disappointment. They weren't hearing him. Worse, the video feed was also becoming hopelessly corrupted. More through the Force than the holocam feed, he saw them moving toward the very doorway he had taken to reach the control room. Exceptional, he thought. Despite his mastery of the Quaytech technique for hiding oneself in the Force, they had located him. Ah, well then, time to entertain them in observance of Sidious's wishes. Plucking his comlink from his belt, Dooku's right thumb leapt across the small touchpad. Heralded by the sound of metallic footfalls, 50 infantry droids crowded into the archive hall through two opposing doorways, perpendicular to the one through which the Jedi had entered. Beginning to things almost as much. I hate sand, Skywalker was saying to his former mentor as he raised his lightsaber over one shoulder. Kenobi spread his legs and brought his blade directly in front of him. Then, sweep up. Touched by their camaraderie, Dooku smiled to himself. Darth Sidious had his work cut out for him if he had ever expected to turn Skywalker to the dark side. He thumbed a final comlink key, and with that, the droids leveled their blaster rifles at the Jedi and opened fire. Yoda surrendered himself to the current of the Force. Sometimes, when the current was swift and steadfast, he could see through the eyes of his fellow Jedi, almost as if they were the temple's remote sensors. And sometimes, when the current was especially forceful, when it surged as if descending from great heights, he could hear the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn as clearly as if he were still alive. Master Yoda, he might say, we still have much to learn. The Force remains a code only partially deciphered, but another key has been found. We will become stronger than we have ever been. Today was not one of those days. Today the current was interrupted by eddies and whirlpools, hydraulic traps whose roar overpowered the voices Yoda sought to hear. Today the current was not pellucid, but muddied by red soil eroded from distant shores, treacherous with obstacles, tainted. Though he was scarcely aware of it, his eyelids were squeezed tight, his eyeballs dancing beneath as if incapable of focusing on any one thing. He had an image of himself drawing aside a veil, only to find another, and another beyond that. The dark side frustrated his every effort to see clearly. The experience was still something new to him. Even though he'd had centuries to grow accustomed to foreboding, he had lived far longer without it. The dark side never completely disappeared. It scratched at the surface like an insect crawling across a transparent steel panel, and he had been able to sense its incremental increases in strength when the Jedi erred, or when the Republic erred, and soon the two were hand in hand. Drawn into the mistakes of the Republic the Jedi had been, but knowingly, and sometimes with full complicity, allowed the dark side to take root the Jedi had, allowed arrogance to infect the order the Jedi had, a priority holding on to power had become, inflated by their own conquests the Jedi became. Some Jedi believed that Yoda wasn't aware of these things, or that he hadn't done enough to stem the tide of the dark side. Some believed that the Council had acted improperly, or worse, ineptly. What they failed to understand was that, once rooted, the growth of the dark side was inexorable and could only be reversed by the one born to restore balance. Yoda was not that one. Aged, experienced, diplomatic, informative, brilliant with a lightsaber, yes, all of these things, and not unacquainted with the power of the dark side. For that reason, he understood just how dangerous this new Sith Lord was. He hadn't had a sense of that danger until he had fought Dooku and Geonosis. Then he understood. In self-exile for 1,000 years, the Sith had not merely been waiting for an appropriate time to re-emerge and exact revenge, but for the birth of one strong enough to embrace the dark side fully and become its dedicated instrument. This was Sidious. Powerful enough to hide in plain sight, powerful enough to instruct his apprentice Dooku to expose him and still remain hidden from the Jedi. And as arrogant as the Jedi, convinced that his way was the one and only way. Did he know about Skywalker? Surely he did. What better way to ensure total victory than by killing or corrupting the Chosen One? Even if not that one, someone so strong in midichlorians. Someone birthed by the Force itself, Qui-Gon would have said. Never a doubt that Anakin's mother might have been lying. The boy had no father. None I choose to remember, none I would honor with that title. The Sith were aware of Skywalker. How would he react when they finally tried to ensnare him? Yoda's eyes snapped open, a disturbance in the Force, of such magnitude that he had been hurled from the current. At his thought command, the window shutters in his quarters opened, and he gazed out at Coruscant, over the plain of the works and beyond. Something was wrong with the sky. Behind gathered clouds turned red and gold by noxious smoke, a light storm. Pulsing light, brighter than the waning rays of Coruscant's sun. Movement as well, outside Coruscant's busy envelope, not seen, but sensed. An attack. The Sith Lord's response to his being chased? Was it possible? He perceived Mace running down corridors in the temple, then turned as Mace rushed through the doorway. At the same instant, a flaming Republic ship streaked past the temple's crowning spires and crashed violently in the heart of the works. Tin, Kun, Ki-Adi-Mundi, and some of the others are on their way up the well, Mace said. I sent Stas Ali to assist Shakti in guarding Chancellor Palpatine. Yoda nodded sagely. Well trained the Chancellor's Red Guards are, but display due concern for his safety, the Jedi must. Reports from Naval Command are garbled, Mace continued. It's clear that the attack caught the home fleet by surprise. Groups of separatist ships managed to penetrate the envelope before the fleet had time to engage. Now, by all accounts, our vessels are holding the line. Yoda adopted an expression that mixed anger and bafflement. Monitoring hyperspace reversion points, our commanders weren't? Mace's eyes narrowed. The separatist fleet jumped from the deep core. Secret, those routes were, known to us and few others. Yoda looked at Mace. Unrestricted access to the archives Dooku had, access enough to erase all mentions of Kamino, access enough to learn of explorations in the deep core. Mace went to the window wall and stared at the sky. Dooku isn't leading this attack. Obi-Wan confirmed he's on Tyth. Revealed the importance of Tyth is, to draw into the Outer Rim additional Jedi. Maybe Palpatine will heed the Council's warnings next time. Improbable, but as you say, perhaps. Mace swung back to Yoda. It's grievous, but he can't be planning to occupy Coruscant. There aren't enough battle droids in the entire galaxy for that. Desperate he is, Yoda said, more to himself. It's not in his programming. Yoda looked up. Not Grievous. Sidious. Mace took a moment to answer. If that's true, then we're closer to finding him than we thought. Still, he can't believe we'd call off the search now. Demoralize Coruscant, Grievous will. Harry those who live in the heights and who wield power. Send them fleeing for safer havens, the attack will. Disrupt the Senate. Mace paced in front of the windows. This will only encourage Palpatine to triple the size of the clone army, construct more and more starships and fighters, strike at more worlds. With the Senate crippled, no one will oppose him. Modulate, this war does. Recall every available Jedi we must. The HoloNet is down, Mace said. Surface communications are distorted by the defensive shields. Yoda nodded. Use the beacon we will. Chapter 40. In the wake of the erratic and mostly unintelligible messages that had reached 500 Republica regarding the Separatists' surprise attack, Dine had considered the sub-basement to be the safest place on Coruscant. But now that the team had discovered a possible finish to the long trail they had followed from the works, the building's vast underground seemed a most dangerous place to be. With a battle raging in space and notwithstanding Mace Windu's command to the contrary, Dine had been tempted to suspend the search for Sidious's lair and report back to the Intelligence Division, as he had ordered the other analysts to do. But as ARC Commander Valiant had pointed out, the search team's objective was as important to the war as the actions of the ships that were protecting Coruscant. So, while the team waited for intelligence to deliver additional probe droids, a search of the sub-basement had begun, admittedly superficial and somewhat desultory, but only in response to the seeming impossibility of the task. Electronically tethered to the probe droids, Dine and the commandos had performed imaging to some of the partitions and walls, and investigated numerous unlit hollows and recesses. The basement became a kind of microcosm for the entire war, with everyone on the team contributing separate skills. Only the interpreter droid, PC-16, was at a loss for something to do. 500 Republica hadn't sustained any follow-up jolts. Dine had learned that the initial jolts had owed not to bombardment, but to the fall of ships destroyed at the edge of space. With thousands of cargo and passenger vessels arriving at Coruscant at any given moment, he could scarcely imagine the chaos upside. Secondary shocks that had rocked the huge building had been traced to the firing of plasma weapons concealed in 500 Republica's cake of a crown. Several hours into the cursory search, Dine had been struck by the possibility that certain Coruscanti, perhaps the Sith Lord himself, could be helping to coordinate the attack. With holonet transmissions jammed and surface communications sabotaged by the defensive shields, he had theorized that the probe droids might be able to home in on exchanges occurring on eccentric frequencies. He was as astonished as anyone when the hovering probe droids had led the team right back to where they had begun the search, where the footprints of their as yet unidentified quarry ended. The source of the unusual frequency was determined to be directly beneath them. The droids had discovered further that the ferrocrete floor panel, thought to have been the end of the trail, was actually a movable platform, not unlike a turbolift, but powered hydraulically rather than by anti-grav repulsor. The search for a hidden control panel, such as had been detected as the niche, hadn't come to anything. But by broadcasting sounds, both within and outside the range of human hearing, the probe droids had ultimately conjured a response from the platform. Following what sounded like a debate, the probe droids had chirped and bleated at the panel a second time. Issuing a resolved click, the panel had descended a couple of centimeters, then come to a halt. Dine recalled wondering where the platform's shaft could lead. Unlike many of Coruscant's tallest buildings, 500 Republica did not rely on the support of earlier structures for its foundation, but was solid almost all the way down to bedrock, or at least was thought to be. This far below Coruscant's civilized crust, there remained areas as unfamiliar as the surfaces of some distant worlds. Dine had decided to contact Mace Windu at the Jedi Temple for advice on how to proceed, but when his repeated attempts failed, he and Valiant had made a command decision to carry on without the Jedi. Ground imaging scans had already shown the shaft to be 50 meters deep. 4 meters in diameter, the panel was large enough to accommodate the entire team, including the interpreter droid. Definitely the most dangerous place to be, Dine thought as he wedged himself among the commandos. The probe droids chirped instructions to the panel, and it began to drop. Slower than would have been the case had it answered to a repulsor lift. The wall of the circular shaft was ancient ceramicrete, cracked and stained in places. "If anyone's down here," Dine said to Valiant, "they're probably aware we're on the way." The commandos didn't need to be told. Weapons enabled, they hurried to firing positions the moment the platform came to rest. Ribboned with conduits and crowded with ancient machinery, the dismal space bore some resemblance to the tunnels and rooms they had passed through and explored since leaving the works. But this one, Dine told himself, was an archaeologist's dream. Probably a maintenance node for buildings that had stood here in Coruscant's dim past. 20 meters ahead of him, flickering light glanced from around the edges of a large metal door. Dine set the droids to investigate, then studied the processor's data screen. "One flesh and blood behind the door," he whispered to Valiant. "Readings also indicate the presence of droids." He looked at the Ark. "It's your call, Commander." Valiant regarded the door. "We've come this far. I say we go in like we own the place." Dine's heart began to race. Find, fix, finish. Chapter 41. In what had served as the archive room from Lamerge Power's plasma facility, droid parts were piling up so fast and so high that Obi-Wan and Anakin could scarcely see Dooku's wavering hollow image any longer. The business of destroying infantry droids, for that's precisely what the confrontation had come down to, was beginning to take a toll on Obi-Wan. The decapitations and amputations were no longer as surgical as they had been when Dukewood first unleashed the droids. The slices that halved his spindly opponents and the thrusts that pierced chest plastrons had lost some of their initial accuracy. Neither he nor Anakin was relying on lightsabers alone. Calling on the Force, they hurled whatever could be lifted from the floor or yanked from the walls. Force pushing 4 droids to the floor, hewing half a dozen more with his flashing blade, Anakin leapt from Obi-Wan's side, landed on the head of a perplexed droid, and began to race toward the far side of the hall, using other heads as stepping stones. But for every droid either of them destroyed, 5 more would appear, creating an impenetrable barrier between them and the doorway through which Dooku had certainly disappeared moments before they had arrived. "Dooku!" Anakin snarled through clenched teeth. "I will kill you!" "Control your rage, Anakin," Obi-Wan managed to say between breaths. "Don't give him the satisfaction." Anakin shot him a worrisome scowl. "Can't have me becoming too powerful now, can we, Master?" Before Obi-Wan could reply, 20 battle droids hurried into the room through the door behind them. Whirling, he deflected their first barrage, then fought his way to cover behind a heap of dismembered droids, where Anakin joined them. In the hope that Dooku was listening from afar, he shouted, "Whatever happens here, Dooku, your confederacy is finished. The Republic has all of you on the run, even your master Sidious." More droids appeared. To Dooku, this was nothing more than a game, Obi-Wan told himself. But if it was a demonstration of Force ability Dooku wanted, then Anakin was still more than willing to provide it. "Dooku!" he howled, with such force and wrath that the ceiling of the vast hall began to collapse. Chapter 42. "Hurry, 3PO, Padme said over her shoulder, "unless you want the Senate to be your final resting place." The protocol droid hastened his pace. "I assure you, mistress, I'm moving as quickly as my limbs permit. Oh, curse my metal body, I'll become entombed here." The broad, ornate hallways leading from the great rotunda were packed with senators, their aides, staff members, and droids, many laden with armloads of documents and data disks, and in some cases expensive gifts received from appreciative lobbyists. Blue-robed Senate guards and helmeted clone troopers were doing their best to oversee the evacuation, but what with the warbling sirens and flying rumors, alarm was beginning to yield to panic. "How could this happen?" A Sullustan was posing to the Godel next to him. "How?" To all sides of her, among Bith, Gran, Wookiees, Rodians, Padme heard the same question being asked. How could Coruscant be invaded? She wondered as well, but she had more to worry about than Coruscant. Where is Anakin? She reached for him in her thoughts, with her heart. "I need you. Come back to me. Quickly." Grievous's strike was impeccably timed. Many delegates who might not have been on Coruscant had come to hear Palpatine's State of the Republic address, and had remained on world to attend the endless parties that followed. In light of the surprise attack, Palpatine's reassurances seemed even more woefully premature now than when he had uttered them. And despite the fact that the Supreme Chancellor's optimistic remarks had been echoed throughout the great rotunda, Padme couldn't help notice that many of her peers were surrounded by cadres of bodyguards, or sporting body armor, jetpacks, or other emergency escape devices. Clearly, Palpatine had failed to lull everyone into complacency. 13 years earlier, Padme could have claimed to be one of the few dignitaries whose homeworld had succumbed to an invasion and occupation. Targeted by the Trade Federation, Naboo had fallen to the Nemoidians. Her parents and advisors were arrested and jailed. Now she was just one of thousands of senators whose worlds had been similarly invaded and ransacked. Regardless, she refused to accept that Coruscant could fall to the Confederacy, even with the home fleet reduced to half its former strength. Word of mouth had it that buildings in the ambassadorial sector had been toppled, that battle droids were surging through Lojin Plaza, that mid-level sky lanes overflowed with Geonosian fan blades and droid fighters. Even if the rumors proved true, Padme was convinced that Palpatine would find some way to drive Grievous from the core. Again. Perhaps he would recall battle groups participating in the Outer Rim sieges. That meant that Anakin would be recalled. She chided herself for being selfish. But didn't she have the right? Hadn't she earned the right? Just this once? Thus far, the Senate building was unscathed. Nevertheless, Homeworld security felt it prudent to move everyone to the shelters deep beneath the hemisphere and the enormous plaza that fronted it. With most of the auto navigation lanes congested, it wasn't as if anyone could flee Coruscant. And there was always the likelihood that Grievous would single out civilian targets, as he had done on countless occasions. Jostled by the surging crowd, Padme collided with a grand delegate who fixed his trio of eye stalks on her. "And you originally opposed the Military Creation Act," he barked. "What do you say now?" There was really no answer. Besides, she had been on the receiving end of similar reproof since the start of the war, typically voiced by those who failed to grasp that her concern was for the Constitution, not for the ultimate fate of the free trade zones. She heard her name called, and turned to see Bail Organa and Mon Mothma angling toward where she and 3PO had momentarily hampered. With them were two female Jedi, Masters Shaak Ti and Stas Ali. "Have you seen the Chancellor?" Bail asked when he could. She shook her head. "He's probably in the holding office." "We were just there," Shaak Ti said. "The office is empty. Even his guards are gone." "They must have escorted him to the shelters," Padme said. Bail glanced at something over her shoulder and raised his hand over his head to call attention to himself. "Masamita," he explained for Padme's benefit. "He'll know where to find the Chancellor." The tall, horned, gray-complected Chagrian fairly shouldered his way through the crowd. "The Supreme Chancellor had no meeting scheduled until later today," he said in answer to Bail's question. "I assume he is in his residence." 500 Republica, Shaak Ti muttered to herself in seeming frustration. "I was just there." Amita gazed down at her in sudden concern. "And the Chancellor wasn't?" "I wasn't looking for him then," the Jedi started to say, then allowed her words to trail off. "Master Ali and I will check the Senate office building in Republica." She glanced at Padme, Bail, and the others. "Where are you going?" "Wherever we're directed to go," Bail said. "The turbolifts to the shelters are overwhelmed," Stas Ali said. "It'll be hours before the Senate is evacuated. My skimmer's at the plaza's northwest landing platform. You can pilot that directly to the shelters." "Won't you and Shaak Ti need it?" Padme asked. "We'll use the speeder bike I arrived on," Shaak Ti said. "We appreciate the gesture," Bail said, "but I heard that the front plaza is cordoned off." Stas Ali took his arm. "We'll escort you." Troopers stationed in the corridor opened a path for the group, and before long they reached the doorways to the main plaza. There, however, a commando blocked their path. "You can't exit this way," the commando told Bail. "They're with us," Shaak Ti said. Waving signals to several of his white-armored comrades, the commando stood aside and allowed Padme's group to pass. The sky above the statue-studded plaza was crowded with gunships and personal carriers. ATTEs and other mobile artillery pieces had already been deployed. The Jedi led Padme, C-3PO, Bail, and Mon Mothma to the open-roofed skimmer. The speeder bike was parked alongside. Shaak Ti swung one leg over the seat and started the engine. Stas Ali settled in behind her. "Good luck," she said. The senators and the droid watched the two Jedi race off in the direction of the Senate office building. Then, with Bail piloting, they boarded the oval-shaped flash skimmer and dropped down into the wide canyon below the plaza. Free travel traffic was thick even there, but Bail's skill got them through the worst of it and on course for the shelter entrances, which were just below the main skydocks of the Senate Med Center. Without warning, two beams of scarlet light stabbed at them from somewhere above the dome of the Senate. "Vulture droids," Bail said. Padme clutched on a C-3PO as Bail veered away from the plasma bolts. The pod-winged droid fighter that had fired was one of several that were strafing vehicles, landing platforms, and buildings in the canyon. Republic gunships were in close pursuit, unleashing with powerful wingtip cannons. Padme's mouth fell open in astonishment. This was something she had never expected to witness on Coruscant. Bail was doing everything he could to keep clear of blaster bolts, plasma, and flak, but so was every other driver, and collisions quickly became part of the obstacle course. Dropping the skimmer lower still, Bail began to head for the nearest shelter entrance as friendly and unfriendly fire ranged closer. A flash of intense light blinded Padme momentarily. The skimmer tipped harshly, almost spilling its occupants into midair. Smoke poured from the starboard turbine nacelle, and the small craft went into a shallow dive. "Hold tight," Bail yelled. "We're doomed," C-3PO said. Padme understood that Bail was swerving for a landing platform that abutted a wide sky bridge. Tears streaming from her eyes, stricken with a sudden nausea, she placed her right hand on her abdomen. "Anakin," she said to herself. "Anakin!" Chapter 43. Flagship of the Separatist flotilla, General Grievous's kilometers-long cruiser, the Invisible Hand, held to a stationary orbit over Coruscant's Senate District, just now in full sunlight, the most majestic of its forest of Ares, standing tall above the clouds. Magnified hollow images of the buildings rose from the tactical table on the cruiser's bridge. Grievous studied the images for a moment before returning to his customary place at the forward view screens. Glinting in daylight, the gargantuan, wedge-shaped assault ships that were, for good reason, the pride of the Republic fleet, were positioned to provide cover for the planet's most important centers. In the first moments of the sneak attack, Grievous had caught a few of the ships with their shields contracted, and those hapless few glided now like flaming torches above Coruscant's pearl-strung night side, fire suppression tenders and rescue ships following in their wake, gobbling up escape pods and lifeboats. The surviving cruisers were managing to keep their separatist counterparts at bay, although that scarcely mattered, since neither aerial bombardment nor invasion was important to the plan. From the point of view of Republic naval commanders, it must have appeared that Grievous lacked a plan, that desperation resulting from his previous defeats in the mid and outer rims had driven him to gather what remained of his fleet and hurl it into a battle he couldn't possibly hope to win. And indeed, Grievous was doing everything he could to encourage that misconception. The warships under his command were haphazardly dispersed, vulnerable to counterattack, concentrating fire on communication satellites and orbital mirrors, lobbing occasional and largely ineffectual volleys of plasma at the world they had come so far and risked so much to assail. All this was crucial to the plan. The tactics of terror had their place. From hundreds of areas on Coruscant's bright and dark side streamed columns of passenger and cargo ships, determined to reach the safety of deep space. Indeed, there were almost as many vessels attempting to depart as there were arriving, constrained to auto-navigation lanes and easy prey because of that. Elsewhere in local space, inward-bound ships that had reverted to real space outside the battle zone had diverted from their approach vectors and were either hanging well to the rear, close to Coruscant's small moons, or deviating for the star system's inner worlds at sublight speeds. In the middle distance, droid fighters and clone-piloted starfighters were destroying one another with a vengeance. Perhaps a wing of vulture fighters had penetrated Republic lines at the start of battle, but many had since been destroyed by orbital platform cannons, flights of high-altitude patrol craft, or ground-based artillery. Others had dashed themselves against the defensive shields that provided additional safeguards for Coruscant's political districts. But that, too, was part of the plan to inspire panic, since the sight of plasma bolts or plummeting ships detonating against those transparent domes of energy could be terrifying. Smoke billowing from some of the capital world's deepest canyons told Grievous that a few of the spearhead droids had succeeded in evading both shields and anti-aircraft fire. Similarly, tentative maneuvers on the part of Coruscant's home fleet vessels told him how eager their commanders were to break formation and engage Grievous head-on. But they had a world to protect, and more important, were too meager in number to proceed with certainty. No doubt they were waiting for reinforcements to arrive from distant systems. Anticipating as much, Grievous had planted surprises for those Republic battle groups closest to the core, surprises in the form of mass shadow mines, and had stationed warships at reversion points along the hyperlanes. If he couldn't prevent reinforcements from arriving, he could at least delay them. If everything went according to plan, the Separatist flotilla would be ready to jump to light speed long before reinforcements reverted in sufficient numbers to pose a serious threat. Grievous took a long moment to absorb the silent battle that flared beyond the thick transparisteel of the bridge viewports. He loathed being so far from the action and bloodshed, but he knew that he had to be patient a while longer. Then all the waiting and frustration would be justified. A Nemoidian addressed him from one of the duty stations. "General, comlink transmissions are returning to normal in sectors of the planet. The enemy appears to have comprehended we are using the jamming suite we employed to our advantage at Prestillon." "This is not unexpected," Grievous said, without turning from the view. "Instruct Group 1 commanders that they should continue targeting orbital mirrors and communication satellites. Relocate the jamming platform to 010 ecliptic and intensify the shields." "Yes, General." The Nemoidian paused and added, "I am compelled to report that we are sustaining heavy losses in all groups." Grievous glanced at the tactical table. Group 1 alone had lost 2 Trade Federation carriers. The Nemoidians had managed to jettison the spherical core of one of the carriers, but the other had been blown completely in half. In the hollow field, the tiny dots spilling from the carrier's curved and now separated arms were droid fighters. Override the survival and engagement programs of those droid fighters, Grievous ordered. Issue a command that they speed directly for Coruscant. They are to convert to explosive devices. Are any specific targets assigned? The outskirts of the Senate District. General, some of our fighters have already infiltrated that sector. Excellent. Command those to target landing platforms, skyways, pedestrian plazas, and shelters. Wherever possible, they are to dedicate themselves to overwhelming Coruscant's civil defense forces. Affirmative. Have any Republic auxiliaries arrived? A task force comprising 4 light cruisers is decanting from hyperspace and advancing from Coruscant's night side. Order our commanders there to engage them. Sooner than expected, Grievous thought. Ordinarily, he would have given thought to contingency plans, but he trusted that Lords Sidious and Tyrannus would apprise him of any changes. Had it not been for the deep-core hyperspace routes the flotilla had taken, the attack could not have launched successfully. Those little-known routes had been furnished by Sidious, who was less concerned with battlefield tactics than with long-range strategies. It was warcraft of a sort Grievous had never practiced. Warcraft in which seeming defeats had resulted in victories, seeming foes proved to be allies. Warcraft of a sort that left the losers with nothing and the winners with everything. The galaxy itself. The Nemoidian communications officer had fallen silent, apparently in reception of an update from one of the duty stations. Now he said, General, a group of Jedi starfighters has emerged from Coruscant's gravity well. How large a group? 22 craft. Deploy as many tri-fighters against them as are needed. Yes, sir. Grievous turned from the viewports. Is the strike force assembled? The gunnery officer took a moment to reply. Your gunboat is ready, and your elites are standing by in the launching bay. Battle droids as well? 50, General. Grievous nodded. That should suffice. He glanced at the viewport a final time, then turned his gaze on the Nemoidian bridge crew. Carry on. Consider every Republic vessel a target of opportunity. I'm sorry, Master, but the beacon still isn't transmitting. Yoda continued to pace the floor of the temple's computer room, then stopped and pointed the business end of his gimmer stick at the Jedi seated at the beacon's control console. Nothing for which to be sorry, he said in reprimand. The Separatists' fault this is. Jamming transmissions from this sector of Coruscant, Grievous is. The Jedi, a brown-haired female human named Lari Ol, lifted her hands from the console and shook her head in confusion. How could Grievous... Dooku, Yoda cut her off. Shares our secrets with his confederates, he does. If one of our starfighters could get past the Separatist blockade, there might be a way of relaying the message to the HoloNet. Yoda nodded. Already considered that, Master Tin has. Attempt to recall Jedi from Belderon, Tyth, and other worlds he will. Can they get back here in time? On Grievous's objective, that depends. Leave Coruscant soon and only slightly bruised, he might. Wait we must until he reveals his plan. Yoda paused to consider his own words, then leaned his weight on the gimmer stick and looked hard at Lariol. Enabled to comm is? Intermittently, Master Yoda. He nodded his chin to the communications council. Call Master Windu. Moments later, Windu's voice issued indistinctly from the council's enunciators. Fisto and I. Senate building. Shak. Ali. To the Chancellor's quarters in 500 Republica, we. With them. Raised, the defense shields are, among one another, districts are unable to communicate. Yoda grimaced, then nodded once more. Master T, try. Lari Ol tried several frequencies before giving up. I'm sorry, she caught herself. No response. Yoda paced away from the council, deliberately turning his back to the glut of devices, screens, data displays, in a kind of countermeasure. Shutting his eyes to distance himself farther, he stretched out with his feelings, placing in his mind's eye Mace and Kit Fisto skimming through the deranged sky, Shak Ti and Stas Ali hurrying toward Palpatine's quarters in 500 Republica, Sassy Tin, Agen Kolar, Boltar Swan, and other Jedi Masters and Jedi Knights streaking from Coruscant's envelope in their starfighters, local space flashing with energy bolts and globular explosions. ships too numerous to count embroiled in a monumental battle. Grievous was loosing his war machines against both military and civilian targets, firing at anything and everything that wandered into his sights, commanding his droid fighters to dash themselves against Coruscant's defensive umbrellas, or race down through traffic lanes, initiating chain reactions of collisions. And yet, for all the diversion, disruption, and terror those stratagems incited, they had little to do with the real battle. As was true of the war itself, the real battle was being fought in the Force. Yoda stretched out further, immersing himself fully in the Force, only to feel his breath catch in his throat. Frigid the current became. Arctic. And for the first time, he could feel Sidious. Feel him on Coruscant. Captain Dine stepped cautiously from the platform that had dropped the team into the unexplored depths of 500 Republica. Here, at an intersection of spooky corridors made of permacrete and surfaced with panels of plasteel, no water dripped, no insects constructed hives, no conduit worms nursed an electrical current. Strangely, however, the air was stirred by a faint and fresh breeze. Dine took a breath to steady his nerves. He was trained for combat, but had spent so many of the past few years doing routine intelligence work that his once sharp reflexes were shot. Commanding the hovering probe droids to go to stasis mode, he deactivated the handheld processor and hooked it on his belt. Drawing his Mare Sun blaster from its holster, he hefted it, then thumbed off the stun setting switch. Ahead of him, ghost-like in the dismal light, the commandos were moving toward the thick door at the end of the hall, keeping close to the walls, with weapons raised. Valiant had the point, with the squad's explosive expert close behind, a thermal detonator in hand. Dine stepped between the powered-down pair of probe droids, TC-16 following in his footsteps. They hadn't advanced 3 meters down the corridor when Dine's ears pricked up at the sound of gurgled voices. He could sense TC-16 come to a sudden halt behind him. "Why, someone is speaking Geonosian," the protocol droid started to say. Whirling, Dine found himself staring down the wide muzzles of 2 organic-looking sonic weapons, grasped in the thick-fingered hands of 2 Geonosian soldier drones, barely visible in the shadows, their wings angled down toward the corridor's grimy floor. The next few moments unfurled in silent, slow motion. Dine understood that it wasn't his life flashing before his eyes, but his death. He saw the commandos drop in their tracks, as if blown over by a gale-force wind. He watched Valiant and the explosives expert leave the floor and hurtle headlong into the door. He observed a storm of probe droid parts whirl past him. He felt himself go airborne and crash into the wall, and his insides turned spongy. It was possible, in that eternal moment of silence, that the troopers had reacted quickly enough to get off a few bolts, because when Dine looked to his right, along the way he had come, there were no signs of the Geonosians, or, for that matter, TC-16. Then again, for all he knew, he had lapsed into unconsciousness for an undetermined amount of time. He was vaguely aware of being slumped against the wall in a position that didn't come naturally to a human being. It was as if every bone in his body had been made pliant. Soundlessly, the distant door opened inward, and light flooded into the corridor. The light was either red or tinted so by the blood that was filling his ruptured eyeballs. Still, set on slow motion, the immediate world came in and out of focus. What remained of his vision registered a room filled with blinking equipment, screens filled with scrolling data, a holoprojector table, above which drifted a Trade Federation battleship, halved and in flames. 2 machine intelligences emerged from the room, their slender, tubular bodies identifying them as assassin droids. Behind them walked a human of medium height and build, who stepped nonchalantly over Valiant's grotesquely twisted body. His liquefying brain notwithstanding, Dine found a moment to be astonished, because he recognized the man instantly. Incredible, he thought. As the Jedi suspected, the Sith had managed to infiltrate the highest levels of the Republic government. The fact that the man had made no attempt to mask himself assured and comforted Dine that he was about to die, and shortly after the realization, he did. Chapter 44. "Where is the Chancellor?" Shakti demanded of the 3 Red Guards stationed outside the entrance to Palpatine's suite in 500 Republica. Alongside her hurried Stas Ali, one hand on the hilt of her lightsaber. In their adamant wake followed 4 members of the building's small army of security personnel who had escorted the Jedi women from a mid-level skydock to the penthouse level. Despite having been notified of their arrival, the imposing Red Guards kept their force pikes raised in defensive postures. Where? Stas Ali said, making it clear she was going to get past them one way or another. Shakti had her hand raised to part the doors with a force wave when the guards lowered their pikes and stepped aside. One punched a code into a wall panel and the pair of burnished doors opened. This way, the same guard said, gesturing the Jedi inside. A broad hallway lined with sculptures and hollow art images led into the suite itself, which, like Palpatine's chambers in the Senate office building, was predominantly red. There was no telling how large the suite was, but the exterior wall of the vast main room followed the curve of the building's crown and looked down on patchy clouds, typical of those that gathered around the building in late afternoon. Distant auto-navigation lanes, transverse and to and from orbit, were motionless with stalled traffic. Between them and 500 Republica hovered 2 LAT gunships and a small flock of patrol skimmers. A distinct disturbance at the crest of the Senate District's defensive umbrella meant that continued bombardment by Separatist forces had rendered the shield permeable. Beyond the super-hot edge of the shield, light flashed within banks of gray clouds. Lightning or plasma, Shakti told herself. Scarcely acknowledging her presence, Palpatine paced into the room like a caged animal, hands clasped behind his back, senatorial robes trailing along the richly carpeted floor. Additional Red Guards and several of Palpatine's advisors stood watching him, some with comlinks plugged into their ears, others with devices Shakti understood to be vital to the continued operation of the Republic military. Should anything befall the Chancellor, authority to initiate battle campaigns and issue war codes would pass temporarily to Speaker of the Senate Masamida, who, Shakti had learned, was already safely ensconced in a hardened bunker deep beneath the Great Rotunda. She couldn't help noticing that Pestage and Isard, 2 of Palpatine's closest advisors, looked nervous. "Why is he still here?" Stas Ali directed at Isard. Isard made his lips a thin line. "Ask him yourself." Shakti practically had to plant herself in Palpatine's path to get his attention. "Supreme Chancellor, we need to escort you to shelter." They were not strangers. Palpatine had personally commended her for her actions at Geonosis, Camino, Dagu, Brental IV, and Centaurus. He stopped briefly to regard her, then swung around and paced away from her. "Master T, while I appreciate your concern, I've no need of rescue. As I've made abundantly plain to my advisors and protectors, I feel that my place is here, where I can best communicate with our commanders. If I were to go anywhere, it would be to the holding office." "Chancellor, communications will be clearer from the bunker," Pestage said. Isard added, "All those familiarization drills you so despised were conducted for just this scenario, sir." Palpatine sent him a skewered grin. Practice and reality are different matters. The Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Senate does not hide from enemies of the Republic. Can I be any clearer? The fact that Palpatine was flustered, confused, possibly frightened was obvious. But when Shakti attempted to read him through the Force, she found it difficult to get a sense of what he was truly feeling. "Chancellor, I'm sorry," Stas Ali chimed in, "but the Jedi are obliged to make this decision for you." He swung to her. "I thought you answered to me." She remained unfazed. "We answer first to the Republic, and safeguarding you is tantamount to safeguarding the Republic." Palpatine deployed his signature penetrating gaze. "And what will you do should I refuse? Use the Force to drag me from my quarters? Pit your lightsabers against the weapons of my guards, who are also sworn to safeguard me?" Shakti traded looks with one of the guards, wishing she could see through the face shield of his red cowl. The situation was becoming dangerous. A shiver born in the Force moved her to glance out the window. "Supreme Chancellor," Pestage was saying, "you must listen to reason." "Reason?" Palpatine snapped. He aimed a finger toward the window. "Have you gazed into our once tranquil skies? Is there anything reasonable about what's going there?" "All the more reason to move you to safety as quickly as possible," Zard said, "so that you can conduct Coruscant's defense from a hardened site." Palpatine stared at him. "In other words, you agree with the Jedi." "We do, sir," Azard said. "And you?" Palpatine asked the captain of his guard. The guard nodded. "Then all of you are in error." Palpatine stormed to the window. "Perhaps you need to take a closer look." Before a further word could fly from his mouth, Shakti and Stas Ali were in motion, Shakti tackling Palpatine to the floor, while Ali ignited her blade and brought it vertically in front of her. Without warning, the gunships closest to 500 Republica were lanced by plasma bolts. Their door gunners blown into midair, the two ships veered and began to fall from the clouds, trailing plumes of fire and thick black smoke. "Unhand me," Palpatine said. "How dare you?" Shakti kept him pinned to the floor and called her lightsaber into her hand. A shrill sound overrode the window's noise cancellation feature, and a separatist assault craft rose into view from somewhere below the suite. Crowded at the side hatches and ready to deploy stood a band of battle droids and others. As the craft hovered closer to the window, Shakti gaped in disbelief. Grievous. "Down!" Stas Ali shouted a moment before the entire window wall blew inward, filling the air with permaglass pebbles. Through the shattered window, droids leapt into the room, opening up with blaster rifles. Stas Ali stood immobile in the rush of wind, noise, and blaster bolts. 6 red guards raced to her side, their deactivated force pikes humming in concert with Ali's lightsaber. Droids fell armless, legless, headless before they made it 2 meters into the room. Blaster bolts deflected by Ali's flashing blue blade blazed out of the window opening, ripping into the other droids, waiting to hurdle the gap between craft and building. For a moment, Shakti was certain that Ali was going to throw herself aboard the hovering gunboat, but there were simply too many droids standing in the way. Keeping Palpatine in a crouch, she grabbed a handful of his robes and began to guide him deeper into the room, her upraised lightsaber parrying bolts that ricocheted from the walls and ceiling. Beaten back, the battle droids broke off their attack. Outside the window, the gunboat was taking heavy fire from a surround of patrol skimmers. As Ali and the Red Guards were felling the final few droids, the Separatist craft dropped back into the clouds, with bolts from the skimmers chasing it. Releasing Palpatine to the custody of 2 guards, Shakti raced to the window and gazed down into the clouds. By then, there was little to see but angry exchanges of cyan and crimson light. She turned to face Azard. "Alert homeworld security that General Grievous has broken through the perimeter." Elsewhere in the room, Pestage was helping Palpatine to his feet. "Ready now, sir?" Palpatine returned a wide-eyed nod. "These familiarization drills you've been conducting," Stas Ali started to say. Azard gestured to one of the side rooms. "The suite is equipped with a secret turbo lift that serves a secure mid-level skydock. An armored gunship is standing by to transport the Chancellor to a bunker complex in the Sak district." "Negative," Shakti said, shaking her head. "Grievous knew enough to come here. We have to assume that the escape route has been compromised as well." "We can't just take him to a public shelter," Azard said. "No," Shakti agreed, "but there are other ways to reach the bunker complex." "Why not use one of the Republica's private turbo lifts?" one of the security guards suggested. "Ride them to the basement levels, and you'll have access to any number of landing platforms." Stas Ali nodded, then glanced at Palpatine. "Supreme Chancellor, your guards are going to encircle you. You are not to attempt to leave that circle under any circumstances. Do you understand?" Palpatine nodded. "I'll do whatever you say." Ali waited until the Red Guards had gathered around him. "Now, quickly!" When everyone had moved into the hallway, Shakti used her comlink to find Mace Windu. "Mace, Grievous is on world," she said the moment she heard his voice. The response was noisy but intelligible. "I just heard." "The Chancellor's escape route may be in jeopardy," she continued. "We're heading for Republica's sub-basements. Can you meet us there?" "Kid and I are nearby." Pressed in the turbolift with Stas Ali, Palpatine's guards and advisors, and Republica's security personnel, Shakti watched the display tick off the floors. No one spoke until the car had reached the first sub-level. "Don't stop," Shakti told the security man closest to the controls. "The deeper we go, the better." "All the way to the bottom?" the man asked. She nodded. "All the way to the bottom. Again." The turbolift deposited them not far from where she had been earlier, though on the opposite side of the tunnel leading to the east skydock. As they hurried for the tunnel, Shakti took a moment to survey the huge space for some sign of Captain Dine's team. Considering all that had happened since she left, it was likely that Dine and Commander Valiant had curtailed the search for Sidious's hideaway. Or perhaps they were still at it, somewhere in the sub-basement. Just short of entering the tunnel, she caught a glance of a bright silver protocol droid that might have been TC-16, hastening toward the exit to the west skydock. The tunnel was darker than it should have been at that time of day, and the lower reaches of the canyon were darker still. Wait here, Shakti instructed the Red Guards and Palpatine when they had reached the mouth of the tunnel. Stas Ali strode to the center of the platform and gazed up at the buildings that loomed on all sides. Grievous's forces must have destroyed the orbital mirror that feeds this sector. Shakti looked straight up at the sliver of sky. The shield is down. They must have taken out the generator. Ali blew out her breath. I'll find an appropriate vehicle to confiscate. Shakti laid a hand on her upper arm. Too risky. We should remain as close to ground as possible. Ali indicated the stairway that led to the mag-level platform. The train won't take us to the bunker complex, but close enough. Shakti smiled at her and reactivated the comlink. Mace, she said when he answered. Another change in plans. Chapter 45. Dragging himself out from under plasteel girders and chunks of ferrocrete, Count Dooku came shakily to his feet and gazed in astonished disbelief at the shambles of the control room. Had the containment dome been so weak that it had succumbed to flurries of ricocheting blaster bolts, or had Skywalker's voiced rage actually called the ceiling down? Had Dooku not leapt forcefully at the last moment, he might have been buried, as the two Jedi were, somewhere below, in the expanse of rubble that covered the archive room. He was certain that they had survived, but if nothing else they were trapped, which had been the intent from the start. But Skywalker... Assuming that he had grown powerful enough to have collapsed the dome, the end result was simply further evidence that he would someday undo himself. Wasn't it? Because admitting that to any alternative explanation meant accepting that Skywalker was potentially a greater threat to the Sith than anyone realized. Initially, it had cheered him to observe that Skywalker and Kenobi had finally learned to fight together, to see how powerful they had come in partnership, complementing each other's strengths, compensating for each other's weaknesses. Kenobi making full use of his inherent discretion to balance young Skywalker's inattentive rowdiness. He could have watched them until the light faded on fair Tyth, and he wished that General Grievous could have been there to witness the display for himself. Now he wasn't so sure. What if it should all come crashing down, he found himself thinking, as he dusted himself off and raced to exit the ruined facility. What if Grievous was outwitted and destroyed at Coruscant? Sidious apprehended and defeated? What if the Jedi should triumph after all? What would become of his dream of a galaxy brought under imminent stewardship? Of Vajun, Yoda had implied that the Jedi Temple would always be open to Dooku's return. But no, there was no turning back from the dark side, especially from the depths in which he had swum. Was there, then, a life of retirement somewhere in the galaxy for the former Count Dooku of Sereno? So much rested on what would take place over the next few standard days. So much rested on whether Lord Sidious's plan could succeed on all fronts, even though forced to unfold hastily because of a foolish oversight by Newt Gunray. Outside, under Tyth's yellow-gray sky, his sloop was waiting, and standing alongside it, the ship's pilot droid. "A recorded message," the droid announced, "from General Grievous." "Play it," Dooku said as he hurried up the sloop's aft boarding ramp and into the instrument-filled main hold. A paused hollow image of the cyborg floated in blue light. Throwing off his dusty cape, Dooku paced while the FA-4 triggered the recording to play. "Lord Tyrannus," Grievous said, in motion suddenly and genuflecting. "Supreme Chancellor Palpatine will soon be ours." Dooku exhaled in satisfaction. "And just in time," he muttered. As if recalled to life, he positioned himself on the transmission grid and sent a simple return message. "General, I will join you shortly." Chapter 46. Padme's eyes fluttered open. Into focus swam the faintly smiling face of Mon Mothma. "No sleeping on the job, Senator," Mon Mothma said, as if from underwater. "We have to get you out of here." Padme took stock of herself, realized she was reclined in the rear seat of Stas Ali's skimmer. Her head was pillowed on Mon Mothma's left arm, and her ears felt as if they were plugged with cotton. "How long?" "Just for a moment," Mon Mothma said in the same watery tone. "I don't think you struck your head. You were fine after the crash. Then you fainted. Can you move?" Padme sat up and saw that the skimmer's safety mechanisms had deployed. Light-headed but unhurt, she brushed her hair from her face. "I can barely hear you." Mon Mothma regarded her in knowing silence, then extended a hand to help her climb from the craft. Padme, you have to be careful. Quickly now. She nodded. Crashing wasn't exactly on my agenda. Mon Mothma hurried her away from the skimmer to where Bail and C-3PO were hiding behind the blockish pedestal of a modernistic sculpture. Master Ali doesn't strike me as someone who will sue for damages, the droid was saying. Still in a daze, Padme grasped that they had skidded into the plaza that fronted the Embassy Mall, taking out a large holo sign and 3 new kiosks along the way. Bail's skill had somehow kept them from mowing down pedestrians who had apparently scattered on first sight of the nosediving ship, or perhaps at the sight of the craft that had fallen to separatist fire ahead of the skimmer. A military police vehicle, similar to a Naboo Guian speeder, tipped on its side against the facade of the mall and belching smoke. Sprawled on the plaza close to the vehicle were the charred corpses of 3 clone troopers. Reality reasserted itself in a rush of deafening noise, flashing light, and acrid smells. From nearby came anguished moans and terrified screams. From the tiered heights above the plaza, distant discharges of artillery. Higher still, plasma bolts raked the sky. Fire bloomed, detonations thundered. Padme saw a smear of blood on Bail's cheek. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he said. "Besides, we have more to worry about." She followed his grim gaze and understood immediately why Coruscanti were fleeing the pedestrian skybridge that linked the mall to the mid-level entrances of the Senate Hospital. 5 vulture droids had alit on the far side of the span and reconfigured to patrol mode. 4-legged gargoyles, with heads deployed forward and sensor slits red as arterial blood, they were striding through Hospital Plaza, sowing destruction. Their 4 laser cannons were aimed downward, but from paired launchers in their semicircular fuselage flew torpedoes aimed at air taxis, craft attempting to dock at the hospital's emergency platforms, the tunnel entrances to the Senate shelters. Republic Lats had dropped from the Senate Plaza to engage the 3.5-meter-tall droids, but were maintaining a wary distance just now, pilots and gunners clearly worried about adding energy weapons or EMP missiles to the chaos. "Zichar monstrosities," Mon Mothma said. Padme remembered standing helplessly at the tall windows of Theed Palace, watching squadrons of vulture fighters fill the sky, like cave creatures loosed on Naboo by darkness. Caught in the crossfire, pedestrians had raced across the sky bridge, hoping to find sanctuary in the Embassy Mall, mid-level in the dome-topped Nakandran Counter-Revolutionary Signalmen's Memorial Building, but thick security gates had been lowered over the entrances, leaving crowds of Coruscanti to scramble for whatever cover could be found. Padme felt faint once more. Huddled, frightened, panicked masses of Coruscanti were suddenly getting a taste of what the inhabitants of Jabeem, Brental, and countless other worlds had faced during the past 3 years. Caught up in a war of ideologies, often by dint of circumstance or location. Caught between the forces of a droid army led by a self-styled revolutionary and a cyborg butcher, and an army of vat-grown soldiers led by a monastic order of Jedi Knights who had once been the galaxy's peacekeepers. Caught in the middle, with no allegiance to either side. It was tragic and senseless, and she might have been broken down and cried if her current circumstances had been different. She felt sick at heart and in despair for the future of sentient life. "Palpatine will never live this down," Mon Mothma was saying, "committing so many of our ships and troopers to the Outer Rim sieges, as if this war he is so intent on winning could never come to Coruscant." Bail frowned in sympathy. "Not only will he live it down, he'll profit from it. The Senate will be blamed for voting to escalate the sieges, and while we're mired in accusations and counter-accusations of accountability, Palpatine will quietly accrue more and more power. Without realizing it, the Separatists have played right into his hands by launching this attack." Padme wanted to argue with him, but didn't have the strength. "They're all mad," Bail continued. "Dooku, Grievous, Gunray, Palpatine." Mon Mothma nodded sadly. "The Jedi could have stopped this war. Now they're Palpatine's pawns." Padme squeezed her eyes shut. Even if she managed to summon the strength, how could she respond, when her own husband was one of them? A general. What had the Jedi gotten Anakin into, taking him from Tatooine, from his youth, his mother? And yet, hadn't she done as much as anyone to encourage him to remain a Jedi, to heed the tutelage of Obi-Wan, Mace, and the others, to perpetuate the lie that was their secret life as husband and wife? She hugged herself. What had she gotten Anakin into? What had she gotten both of them into? Bail's voice snapped her from self-pity. "They're coming." He aimed a finger across the plaza. They're coming across the bridge. From somewhere in the vulture droid's brains had come a revelation that the pedestrian skyway offered a better vantage for targeting buildings and craft to both sides of the kilometer-deep canyon. More important, the gunships were even less likely to fire on them there, lest they destroy the span and send it plummeting to the busy thoroughfares and maglev lines 200 stories below. Perhaps if we throw ourselves on the mercy of the owners of the mall, they will raise the security gate, C-3PO started to say. Bale looked at Padme and Mon Mothma. We have to keep those droids on the far side of the bridge so the gunships can take them out. Mon Mothma glanced at the overturned military craft. I see a way to try. The craft sat scarcely 50 meters from the base of the sculpture. Without further word, the three of them hurried for it. What could I possibly have been thinking? C-3PO shouted as he watched them search the craft for weapons. It can never be the easy answer. The three humans returned momentarily, carrying 3 blaster rifles. Not much power left, Bale said, checking one of them. Yours? Low on blaster gas, Padme said. Mon Mothma ejected the power pack from hers. Empty. Bale nodded glumly. We'll have to make do. Hunkering down behind the pedestal, he and Padme took careful aim on the closest of the walking droids. By then, 3 had started onto the skyway, firing at random. Exploding against the facades of buildings above and below, torpedoes sent slabs of Durasteel reinforced ferrocrete avalanching onto plazas, landing platforms and balconies, burying scores of hapless Coruscanti. Be prepared to move as soon as we fire, Bale said. He indicated one of the kiosks that had survived the crashes of both speeders. There's our first cover. Padme centered the lead droid in the blaster's targeting reticle and squeezed the trigger. Her initial burst did little more than catch the droid's attention, but subsequent bolts from both blasters started to score hits on vital components. The droid actually retreated a couple of steps toward Hospital Plaza, only to launch a trio of torpedoes straight across the skyway. Padme and company were already in motion. One torpedo hit the pedestal, blowing it and the sculpture to fragments. A second slagged what was left of Stas Ali's skimmer. The third detonated against the lowered security grate, blowing a gaping hole into the mall. Pedestrians to both sides hastened for it, fighting with one another to be first to the smoking maw. Padme thought that one of the vultures would target them, but in their moment of inattention, the droids had left themselves open to strafing runs by the gunships. Converging beams of bright light streaked from the fire dishes of the Lat's wing and armature-mounted ball turrets, and staccato bursts erupted from the forward guns. 2 droids exploded. One turned to answer the volleys, but not in time. Missiles from the gunship's mass drive launchers took off the droid's left legs, then the head, then blew the rest clear across the plaza. The remaining 2 vultures skittered onto the skyway to increase their odds of survival. Bale and Padme laid down steady lines of fire, but the droids were undeterred. And I thought the Senate was a battlefield, Mon Mothma said. The sight of smoke curling from holes in the lead droid's fuselage seemed to invigorate the one behind. Driving Padme and the others in search of new cover with a single torpedo, the droid scurried forward, edging around its stricken comrade and stepping brazenly into the mall plaza, red sensors gleaming. A gunship made a quick pass, but couldn't find a clear field of fire. I'm out, Bale said, dropping his rifle. Padme checked her weapons display screen. Same. C-3PO shook his head. How will I ever explain this to R2-D2? They broke for cover a final time, hoping to throw themselves through the ragged hole in the still smoking security grate, but the droid hurried to intercept them. Then, in seeming sadistic delight, began to back the 4 of them against the wall of the Nicandran building. A rage began to build in Padme, born of instincts as old as life itself. She was on the verge of hurling herself against a towering machine, ripping the sensors from its teardrop-shaped head, when the droid came to a sudden halt, obviously in reception of some remote communication. Retracting its head and stiffening its scissor-like legs into wings, it turned, and launched itself over the edge of the plaza into the canyon below. The droid on the skyway did the same, even with 2 gunships in close pursuit. Padme was first to reach the skyway railing. Far below, the Senate District maglev was racing south toward the sky tunnel that would take it through the kilometer-wide Horium complex and out onto the wealthy Sak districts. The 2 vulture droids were swooping down to join ranks with a separatist gunboat that was already chasing the train. Chapter 47. How had Grievous known to attack 500 Republica? Mace asked himself as the maglev rushed at 300 kilometers per hour toward the sky tunnel that would spirit the train from the Senate district. Having boarded the maglev at its 500 Republica platform, he, Kit Fisto, Shock T, and Stas Ali were in the car the Supreme Chancellor's Red Guards had commandeered, second in a train of some 20 cars. Through a gap in the protective circle the guards had forged, Mace caught a glimpse of Palpatine, his head of wavy gray hair lowered in what might have been anguish or deep concentration. How had Grievous known? Mace asked himself. Many Coruscanti knew that Palpatine resided in 500 Republica, but the location of his suite was a well-kept secret. More important, how had Grievous known that Palpatine wasn't to be found in either of his offices? Not everything could be traced to Dooku. It was conceivable that Dooku had furnished Grievous with data on hyperlanes that skimmed the outer limits of the deep core. That much Dooku could have pilfered from the Jedi archives before he left the Order, presumably when he was erasing mentions of Kamino from the databanks. Similarly, Dooku could have supplied Grievous with the orbital coordinates of specific communication satellites and mirrors, or with tactical information regarding the location of dedicated shield generators on the surface. But Palpatine had only just been elected Supreme Chancellor when Dooku left Coruscant to return to Sereno, and back then, some 13 years ago, Palpatine had been living in a high-rise tower close to the Senate building. So how had Grievous known to go to 500 Republica? Sidious? If it was true that hundreds of senators had, for a time, been under the Sith Lord's influence, then he may have had access to the highest levels of confidential information. As many on the Jedi Council feared, Sidious's network of agents and assets might have infiltrated the Republic military command itself, which suggested that the sneak attack on Coruscant may have been years in the planning. Mace caught another glimpse of Palpatine, insulated by the flowing red robes of his hand-picked bodyguards. This was hardly the time to question him about his closest confidants, but Mace would make it his business to find the time later. Briefly, he wondered what had become of Captain Dine's team. Surmising that Dine had called off the search for Sidious shortly after the attack had commenced, Intelligence hadn't dispatched a second search team, aimed at locating Dine and Valiant, until neither of them had been heard from, even after communications had been restored to the Senate district. Shock T hadn't seen them when she and Palpatine's protectors had whisked the Supreme Chancellor through 500 Republica's sub-basement. So had Dine and the Commandos fallen victim to Grievous's attack? Were they trapped somewhere under a crashed cargo ship or tons of Ferrocrete rubble? Yet another ill-timed concern, Mace thought. The Maglev's other cars were packed cheek to jowl with Coruscanti attempting to flee the Senate and financial districts. Palpatine's guards would have commandeered the entire train if Palpatine hadn't intervened, refusing to allow it. Shock T had told Mace and Kit about the Supreme Chancellor's earlier reluctance to leave his suite. Mace didn't know what to make of it, but now at least they were on their way to the bunker. The maglev line didn't run past the complex, but the first stop in Sock was close to a system of skyways and turbolifts that did. Light filtering into the car through the tinted windows dimmed. The maglev was entering into Horium Sky Tunnel, a broad burrow that accommodated not only the speeding train, but also opposing lanes of auto navigation and free travel traffic, passing through several of the Senate District's largest buildings. Lanes leading south, away from the district, and off to the right side of the maglev were crawling with public transports and air taxis. By contrast, the northbound lanes were almost empty, the result of traffic having been rerouted well before it reached the Senate district. A blur of light off to the left-hand side of the car caught Mace's eye, and he hurried to the closest window. Streaking southbound in the northbound free travel lane, 2 droid fighters were trying to overtake the train. Before Mace could utter a word of warning, cannon fire from one of the twin-winged ships stitched a broken line of holes across the blunt nose of a transport in the auto-navigation lane. Instantly, the transport exploded, savaging nearby vehicles with shrapnel and nearly rocking the maglev from its elevated guide rails. Screams issued from Coruscanti wedged into the cars to the front and rear of Palpatine's. "Vulture fighters," Mace told the Jedi and Red Guards. Leaning low at the window, he saw one of the droids climb over the maglev, only to descend on the opposite side of the train in the midst of the free lane travel, initiating a succession of collisions that flung speeders, taxis, and buses all over the sky tunnel. 2 vehicles careened into the train, only to rebound back into the travel lane, starting a second series of fatal crashes. Racing alongside Palpatine's car, the same droid responsible for the collision surged into a steep climb and disappeared from view. Not a moment later, an ear-splitting sound reached Mace from somewhere in the rear of the train and overhead. Behind the tinted glass, sparks showered down the rounded sides of the car, and the smell of molten metal wafted from the ventilation grills. A tumult of terrified cries rose from the car directly behind Palpatine's, and hands and feet began to pound against the passageway door. Part of a group of maglev security personnel stationed there, a weak way, turned to Mace. "We won't be able to hold them back." In turn, Mace whirled to Shakti and Ali, moved the Chancellor into the forward car. Shakti regarded him as if he had lost his mind. "It's packed, Mace." "I know that. Find a way." He gestured for Kit Fisto, and the two of them shouldered through the cluster of security personnel at the rear of the car and activated their lightsabers. Faced with the purple and blue blades, passengers on the far side of the door's window began to retreat into the vestibule, battling with those behind them who were attempting to press into the forward car. When there was enough space in the vestibule, Mace instructed the Weequay to unlock the door. Without hesitation, he and Kit dashed through the vestibule and on into the rear car, where most of the mixed-species passengers were heaped atop seats to both sides of the wide aisle. Wind howled through the car from a jagged rend that had been opened in the roof, and through which had dropped half a dozen infantry droids. Mace allowed himself a moment of bewilderment. Since the battle droids couldn't have been delivered by the droid fighters, there had to be a third separatist craft racing alongside the train. The battle droids opened fire. To many of the passengers, all but fused to the tinted windows, the situation must have seemed hopeless. Not because the two Jedi couldn't deflect the hail of blaster bolts aimed at them, but because they couldn't deflect them without sending some into or through people in the car. But those passengers failed to recognize that one of the Jedi was Mace Windu, rumored to have single-handedly destroyed a seismic tank on Dantooine, and the other was Kit Fisto, Natolan, hero of the Battle of Mon Calamari. Together they returned some of the sizzling bolts into the advancing droids. Others they sent whizzing through the opening in the roof, managing in the process to catch one of the vultures in the belly, and send it spiraling to its death somewhere below the maglev line. Sparks and smoke whirled through the car, and parts of spindly arms and legs flew about unavoidably, but Mace and Kit called on the Force to control even those. A few Coruscanti were struck, but against all odds the Jedi saw to it that none was critically injured. No sooner had the final droid dropped than Mace leapt straight up through the rend, landing in a crouch on the roof of the next car down the line, holding himself in place by the Force with the wind whipping at the back of his shaved skull and coarse tunic. Senses on alert, he saw a separatist craft drop down behind the final car in the line. Farther away, but quickly making up the distance, flew two Republic gunships. Instinctively, he glanced to the right just as the second vulture droid was rocketing into view. Seeing him, the droid sprayed the roof of the car with cannon fire. Mace turned into the powerful wind and focused all his attention on a front flip that carried him back through the rend. The vulture veered, positioning itself directly over the laceration its partner had opened, and reorienting its wing cannons. In what would surely have been a futile act, Mace raised his lightsaber. But the expected cannon blast never arrived. Wings clipped and repulsors damaged by missiles fired from the gunships, the vulture slammed down onto the roof of the speeding train, then rolled out of sight. Deactivating their blades, Mace and Kit rushed into the forward car, which was now filled with Palpatine's advisors and those passengers the Jedi women and Red Guards had relocated from the train's lead car. Mace and Kit continued to swarm forward, arriving in the Supreme Chancellor's car just as the maglev was emerging from the sky tunnel. The sun was going down, and the tall buildings that rose to the west cast enormous shadows across the city canyon and the busy thoroughfares far below the cancer-leveled maglev line. In the middle of the car, Palpatine stood at the center of the cordon the Red Guards had formed around him, and at a fixed-pane window they had deliberately shattered, Shakti and Stas Ali were gazing toward the rear of the train. "Those fighters could easily have derailed us with a torpedo," Shakti said as Mace and Kit approached. Mace leaned partway out the window, eyes searching the canyon. "And battle droids don't just drop from the sky. There's a third craft." Kit's bulging black eyes indicated Palpatine. "They want to take him alive." The words had scarcely left his mouth when something hit the train with sufficient force to whip everyone from one side of the car to the other, then back again. The Red Guards were just regaining their balance when the roof began to resound with the cadence of heavy, clanging footfalls, advancing from the rear of the train. "Grievous," Mace grumbled. Kit glanced at him. "Here we go again." Hurrying into the vestibule between the two lead cars, they launched themselves to the roof. 3 cars distant marched General Grievous and 2 of his elite droids, their capes snapping behind them in the wind, pulse-tipped batons angled across their barrel chests. Farther back, clamped by animal-like claws to the roof of the train, was the gunboat from which the frightful trio had been released. Without pausing, Grievous drew 2 lightsabers from inside his billowing cloak. By the time they were ignited, Mace was already on and all over the cyborg, batting away at the 2 blades, swinging low at Grievous's artificial legs, thrusting at his skeletal face. The lightsabers thrummed and hissed, meeting one another in bursts of dazzling light. In a corner of Mace's mind, he wondered to which Jedi Grievous's blades had belonged. Just as the Force was keeping Mace from being blown from the Maglev's roof, magnetism of some sort was keeping the General fastened in place. For the cyborg, though, the coherence hindered as much as it helped, whereas Mace never remained in one place for very long. Again and again the 3 blades joined in snarling attacks and parries. As Mace already knew from Ki-Adi-Mundi and Shaak-Ti, Grievous was well trained in the Jedi arts. He could recognize the hand of Dooku in the General's training and technique. His strikes were as forceful as any Mace had ever had to counter, and his speed was astonishing. But he didn't know Vapid, the technique of dark flirtation in which Mace excelled. To the rear of the car, where Grievous's pair of Magna Guards had made the mistake of pitting themselves against Kit Fisto, the Natolan's blade was a cyclone of blazing blue light. Resistant to the energy outpourings of a lightsaber, the Puric alloy staffs were potent weapons. But unlike any weapon, they needed to find their target, and Kit simply wasn't allowing that. In moves a Twi'lek dancer might envy, he spun around the guards, claiming a limb from both with each rotation. Left legs, right arms. The speed of the train saw to the rest, ultimately whisking the droids into the canyon like insects blown from the windscreen of a speeder bike. The loss of his Confederates was noted by whatever computers were slave to Grievous's organic brain, but the loss neither distracted nor slowed him. His sole setting was attack. Successful at analyzing Mace's lightsaber style, those same computers suggested that Grievous alter his stance and posture, along with the angle of his parries, ripostes, and thrusts. The result wasn't vapid, but it was close enough, and Mace wasn't interested in prolonging the contest any longer than necessary. Crouching low, he angled the blade downward and slashed, guiding it through the roof of the car, perpendicular to Grievous's stalwart advance. Mace saw by the surprised look in the cyborg's reptilian eyes that, for all his strength, dexterity, and resolve, the living part of him wasn't always in perfect sync with his alloy servers. Clearly Grievous, one-time courageous commander of sentient troops, realized what Mace had done and wanted to sidestep, where General Grievous, current commander of droids and other war machines, wanted nothing more than to impale Mace with lunging thrusts of the paired blades. Slipping into the gap made by Mace's saber, Grievous's left talon lost magnetic purchase on the roof, and the General faltered. Mace came out of his crouch, prepared to drive his sword into Grievous's guts, but some last-instant firing of the General's cyber synapses compelled the cyborg's torso through a swift half-twist that would have sent Mace's head hurtling into the canyon had the maneuver prevailed. Instead, Mace leapt backward, out of the range of the slicing blades, and force-pushed outward, just at the instant of Grievous's single misstep. Off the side of the car the General went, twisting and turning as he fell. Mace trying to track the General's contorted plunge, but unsuccessfully. Had he fallen into the canyon? Had he managed to dig his geranium claws into the side of the car or grab hold of the maglev rail itself? Mace couldn't take the time to puzzle it out. 100 meters away, the gunboat retracted its landing gear and rose from the roof on repulsor lift power. Reckless shots from one of the pursuing gunships obliged the Separatist craft to skew, then dive, with the gunship following close behind. Mace and Kit watched in awe as the 2 ships began to helix forward around the speeding maglev, exchanging constant fire. Climbing away from the train's sharp nose, within which the magnetic controls were housed, the gunboat made as if to bank west, only to bank east at the last instant. By then, however, the gunship, leading its target west, had already fired. Drilled by a swarm of deadly hyphens, the maglev's control system blew apart, and the entire train began to drop. Chapter 48. In the darkness, buried alive, Anakin stretched out with his feelings. In his mind's eye he saw Padme stalked by a dark towering creature with a mechanical head, poised at the edge of a deep abyss, her world turned upside down. A surprise attack. Opponents locked in combat, ground and sky filled with fire, smoke billowing in the air, clouding everything. Death, destruction, deceit. A labyrinth of lies. His world turned upside down. He shuddered, as if plunged into liquid gas. One touch would break him into a million shards. His fear for Padme expanded until he couldn't see past it. Yoda's voice in his ear. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hatred. Hatred to the dark side. He was as afraid to lose her as he was to hold on to her, and the pain of that contradiction made him wish he had never been born. There was no solace, even in the Force. As Qui-Gon had told him, he needed to make his focus his reality. But how? How? Qui-Gon, who had died, even though to his young mind Jedi weren't supposed to. Beside him, Obi-Wan stirred and coughed. "You're getting awfully good at destroying things," he said. "On Vajun, you needed a grenade to do this much damage." Anakin shook the vision from his mind. "I told you I was becoming more powerful." "Then do us both a favor by getting us out from under all this." They used the Force, their hands and backs, to extricate themselves. Getting to their feet, they stood staring at each other, dusted white, head to toe from the debris. "Go ahead," Anakin said. "If you don't say it, I will." "If you insist." Obi-Wan snorted dust from his nose. "Almost makes me nostalgic for Now's 3. "Once more, with feeling." "Some other time. Dooku first." Scampering over the remains of the dome, droid parts, buried pieces of furniture, overturned shelves of holodocuments, they raced for the landing platform, arriving in time to see Dooku's sloop, one among dozens of Separatist vehicles, streaking for space. "Coward," Obi-Wan said. "He flees." Anakin watched the sloop for a moment longer, then looked at Obi-Wan. "That's not the reason, Master. We've been tricked. Tyth was never the target. We were." Chapter 49. Bleeding speed and loft, the maglev settled hard onto the guide rail that projected from the skyscraper-lined rim of Sock Canyon. Counterpoint to the sobs and moans of the passengers, the 24 cars, two now with slashed-open roofs, pinged and creaked. Balanced on the balls of their feet, Mace and Kit hooked their lightsabers to their belts and drifted back down into the vestibule, as gently as the Force allowed. As if buffeted by thermals, the train swayed lazily from side to side. But with traffic halted in both directions, the air at mid-level should have been unruffled. A quick glance out the right side of the vestibule supplied Mace with the explanation. The aged, cantilevered supports anchored to the sides of the buildings were beginning to bend under the weight of the train. In the distance, sirens wailed and dopplered as emergency craft hurried to render aid. Left of the stricken maglev, two enormous repulsor lift platforms were making a careful approach. Waiting for the train to quiet, Mace and Kit stood like statues in the vestibule. When the rocking motion had subsided somewhat, they pressed the release stud for the passenger door and eased themselves into the lead car. The train continued to protest its peculiar circumstance with an assortment of stressful sounds, but the sagging supports held for a few seconds more. Then, with explosive reports, the rail supports beneath the center of the train tore away from the canyon rim, taking a lengthy portion of the rail with them. The train V'd into the sudden gap, and would have plunged completely but for the fact that enough forward and rear cars remained clasped to the rail to support the few that now formed an inverted triangle. Even so, Coruscant and the rear were propelled forward by the collapse, with those in the lead cars were jerked violently backward. Steps into Palpatine's car, Mace and Kit called on the Force to prevent everyone from flailing toward the vestibule door. Farther forward in the car, Shaak Ti and Stas Ali were keeping the Supreme Chancellor on his feet. Strident sounds issued from the guide rail. The maglev lurched and another two cars slipped into the V-notch, their motion adding a sudden twist to the train that turned some of the cars onto their sides, and sent passengers sliding and tumbling toward the tinted windows. Coruscanti screamed in terror, bracing themselves as best they could, or clawing at one another for support. Centered in the Force, Mace directed all his energy toward keeping the Red Guards and others rooted in place. He wondered if he, Kit, Shaak Ti, and Ali, acting in concert, could support the entire train, but dismissed the idea immediately. They would need Yoda. Perhaps 5 Yodas. Unexpectedly, a feeling of relief flowed through him. The emergency repulsor lifts, Kit said. Once more the train lurched, but this time the cars began to level out as anti-grav repulsors levitated those that had dropped into the notch. By then, too, the pair of repulsor lift platforms had cozied up to the train's left side, and scores of emergency craft were rushing in from all sides. Mace could feel an increasing sense of desperation sweep through the cars as passengers grew frantic to exit. He knew it was only going to get worse, since none of them would be allowed to leave until Palpatine had been moved to safety. He and Kit did their best to make that happen as quickly as possible. Within moments, they had ushered everyone who had been in the lead car onto one of the platforms. Pressed in among his red guards, Palpatine couldn't even be seen. Disengaging from the maglev, the platform was moving away from the train before a single passenger, even any of Palpatine's advisors, could scramble out onto its twin. The air was filled with escort craft and gunships, 2 of which put down on the platform as it was closing on the canyon's eastern rim. Leaping out of the craft, 2 platoons of commandos assumed firing positions along the platform's perimeter. Behind them came 4 Jedi Knights who rushed to join Shaak Ti and Stassa Lee in guarding Palpatine. Mace recognized the more scorched of the pair of gunships as one of 2 that had been in pursuit of Grievous's gunboat. Hurrying over to it, he signaled the pilot to raise the bubble canopy. Cupping his hands to his mouth, he said, "What became of the gunboat?" "My wingmate is in pursuit, General," the pilot said. "We're awaiting word." "Did Grievous fall from the maglev?" "I was too far behind to see much of anything, sir, but I didn't see him fall, and I didn't see anyone on the train." Mace replayed the events in his mind, saw himself force-pushing Grievous from the roof of the car, saw Grievous plunging over the edge, down out of sight, toward the rail of the canyon floor. The cyborg's gunboat disengaging from the train, descending into the canyon before it and the second gunship had commenced their corkscrewing race around the maglev. Mace clenched his hands and swung to Kit. The gunboat could have caught him. Somehow. He gazed up at the pilot again. "Any word yet?" "Coming in now, sir. Sector H-52. My wingmate is in close pursuit. I'd better get a move on." "General Fisto and I are going with you." Mace turned to Shaak Ti, Ali, and the 4 newly arrived Jedi Knights. Shaak Ti nodded at him. "We'll see the Chancellor the rest of the way to the bunker." Shaak Ti was the last aboard the gunship that would deliver Palpatine to shelter, somewhere deep in the narrow service chasms that fractured the exclusive Sak neighborhood. Encircled by the contingent of red guards, Palpatine stood silently in the rear of the troop bay. His hair and robes were mussed, and he looked pale and feeble among his striking protectors. Stassa Lee and the 4 Jedi Knights Yoda had dispatched from the temple stood just inside the door, shoulder to shoulder with commandos and government agents. Shaak Ti knew the human male Jedi and the female Twi'lek by sight, but she couldn't recall ever running into the other 2, a male Talz and a male Ithorian. All 4 of them looked able enough, though she hoped there would be no call for them to demonstrate their skills. Moments earlier, the gunship carrying Mace and Kit had banked north, back toward the Senate District, in apparent pursuit of Grievous's gunboat. Palpatine's gunship had taken off to the south and had immediately begun to descend. Dusk had already fallen on the rim of the canyon. Bruised by the day's events, Coruscant's skies were a swirl of blood-red, orange, and deep lavender. Down below, the buildings and thoroughfares were illuminated. Halfway to the floor of the canyon, a gunship that had seen recent action fell in alongside the Supreme Chancellor's, and remained just off to starboard and slightly astern, through the numerous twists and turns that had led ultimately to the mountainous structure that served as the bunker complex. A final turn to the north brought the 2 gunships to the mouth of a narrow urban ravine, where they hovered for the moment it took to lower the particle shield that safeguarded the shelters, tactical and communication centers, landing platforms, and the network of tunnels that linked them. The complex could be reached by alternative means. Under normal circumstances, Palpatine would have been conveyed by repulsor lift speeder through deep tunnels that arrived from 500 Republica, the Great Rotunda, and the Senate Office Building. But the ravine was the best way of entering from anywhere west of the Senate or financial districts. Shaak Ti didn't allow herself to relax until the gunships had been cleared through the shimmering screen and had been issued approach vectors for landing. Her relieved exhale seemed to go on and on. The escort gunship shot ahead and was ready on the pad when Shaak Ti and the rest arrived moments later. The craft bearing the Supreme Chancellor had scarcely touched down when the side doors flew out and back, and the Red Guards hurried Palpatine off to a waiting speeder. The commandos leapt out to reinforce the bunker's contingent of troopers. Shaak Ti instructed the 4 Jedi Knights to accompany the Red Guards, promising to join them after she and Stas Ali had apprised the temple of their safe arrival. The 2 Jedi women watched the speeder race off into the broad tunnel that assessed the bunker, then swung themselves down to the landing pad. Ali grabbed her comlink and depressed the send button. After several failed attempts to reach the temple, she glanced at Shaak Ti. Too much interference. Let's move away from the ship. It was the interference that saved them from the explosion that mangled and consumed the gunship. As it was, the blast set their robes on fire and hurled them 10 meters through the air. Retaining consciousness, Shaak Ti used the momentum to propel herself through a tucked roll that carried her almost to the edge of the landing platform. Stas Ali lay face down nearby. The missile that had destroyed the gunship had been launched by the craft that had preceded them into the ravine. That same craft's several cannons were firing now, laying waste to other vessels and making short work of the troopers. Shaak Ti saw several soldiers jump from the gunship's doors and move with astounding speed into the mouth of the access tunnel. She raised herself to one knee, then sprinted to Stas Ali's side to put out the flames that had engulfed her cloak. Ali stirred and raised herself on the palms of her hands. "Stay down," Shaak Ti warned. As the gunship was lifting off, no doubt to gain a better vantage on the landing platform, additional troopers appeared from somewhere below the landing pad. Rocket-propelled grenades swarmed after the racing craft, several of them infiltrating the vented nacelles of the repulsor lift engines. The ensuing detonation resounded in the ravine and cast fiery hunks of metal in all directions. Shaak Ti curled her body and tucked her head to her chest. A wave of intense heat washed over her and Ali, and a hail of fragments clanged and clattered down around her. One of the last pieces to land, not 2 meters from her face, was the charred head of a battle droid. Chapter 50. Mace and Kit stood in the open doorway of the Republic gunship as it threaded its way among the monads and skyscrapers of the Senate District. Grievous's gunboat raced ahead, darting left and right as it fired continuously at its pursuer. Mace backed into the gunship as bolts sizzled past the doorway, nearly catching the underside of the starboard wing. The fact that it had taken so little effort to track and catch up with the Separatist craft gnawed at Mace. Neither he nor Kit could shake the feeling that the gunboat had practically been waiting for them above the squat Senate building, and had only then attempted to go evasive. And yet it had obviously eluded the original gunship that had chased it through the Sox sky tunnel. Mace leaned into the hatch to the gunner's compartment and called up to him. "Where's your wingmate?" "Lost him, sir," the gunner shouted. "He's not anywhere on the tactical screen." "The ship could have gone down," Kit suggested. Mace's brow furrowed. "I don't think so. Something's wrong about this." Overhead, missiles roared from the launchers, and an explosion boomed and echoed from the surrounding buildings. Black smoke and debris swept past the doorway, and the gunner whooped. "We got him, sir! He's trailing fire and surface-bound!" Mace and Kit leaned out of the doorway in time to see the gunboat tip to one side, then begin a rapid downward spiral. "Stay with him, pilot!" Mace yelled. Coiling into a city chasm east of the Senate, the craft clipped the edge of a skydock and started to come apart. The pilot of the gunship jinked to avoid airborne wreckage, but managed to remain in the wake of the doomed ship. The collision with the skydock had added an end-over-end flip to the gunboat's spiral, and now the craft was simply falling like a stone, straight down toward brightly illuminated Uskru Boulevard, which was blessedly free of traffic. Fire sputtering out, it hit the surface nose first, cratering the street and shattering windows and buildings to all sides. Maintaining a safe distance from the crash site, the gunship pilot engaged the repulsor lift engines and hovered to a landing at the frayed edge of the impact crater. Mace, Kit, and a dozen commandos jumped to the hot ground to secure the area. Crowds of startled onlookers formed almost immediately, and the sirens of emergency vehicles began to wail in the distance. Lightsabers ignited, Mace and Kit strode along the perimeter of the shallow well, alert to the slightest movements. The crumpled ship had been torn open from bow to stern along one side, and they had clear views into every cabin space. Neither Grievous nor any of his elite guards were anywhere to be found. Only battle droids, slagged, mangled, twisted into peculiar shapes. I can accept that Grievous might have fallen from the maglev, Mace said, but not that he would have included only 2 of his elite on a mission like this. Kit gazed at the wedge of night sky. There could be a second assault craft. Pilot, Mace called toward the gunship. Comlink the Supreme Chancellor's bunker, and arrange for us to be cleared through the shield. Grievous and 6 Magna Guards cut a bloody swath through the broad corridors that led ultimately to Palpatine's sanctuary. Republic soldiers, cloned and otherwise, fell to Grievous's lightsabers and the deadly staffs of his elite. Behind them, the firefight at the landing platform was raging. If nothing else, Grievous told himself, the clash would tie up 2 of the Jedi and dozens of troopers. Thus far, things were still on target, if not proceeding according to plan. At Palpatine's apartment, Grievous had managed to fool everyone by placing the gunboat on display, then clandestinely transferring himself and his combat droids into the Republic gunship Lord Tyrannus had promised would be waiting for them. He had been forced to improvise when Palpatine's protectors had opted to follow an alternate route to the bunker, and he enjoyed chasing the maglev, if not the brief duel on the roof of the train car. Tyrannus had warned him about Mace Windu's prowess with a blade, and now he understood. His literal misstep had shamed him, and he was grateful that the 2 Magna Guards that had fought at his side had not survived to bear witness to it. Had he not managed at the last instant to grab hold of the maglev rail and be retrieved by the borrowed gunship, all the efforts the banking clan had undertaken to have him rebuilt would have been for nothing. But as it happened, he was now about to give the Separatists more than their credit's worth, perhaps a means to proclaim themselves victors of the war. Grievous and 5 remaining droids completed their march to the bunker, deflecting the fire of 3 troopers guarding the entrance, then decapitating them. Hexagonal, the sturdy portal was impervious to blaster bolts, radiation, or electromagnetic pulse. Grievous was well aware that his lightsabers were capable of burning through the door. While doing so would have heightened the drama of his entry, he did the next best thing. He used the code Tyrannus had provided. Under no circumstances are you to harm the Chancellor, he exhorted his elite, while layers of the thick hatch were retracting. The astonishment registered by Palpatine and his quartet of Jedi Knights assured Grievous that he could not have made a more dramatic entry. A large desk dominated the circular room, and banks of communications consoles formed the circumference. Centered in the curved wall opposite the entrance was a second door. Posing for effect in the polygonal opening, Grievous granted his opponents a moment to activate their lightsabers, force pikes, and other weapons. Also for effect, he deflected the initial flurry of blaster bolts with his clawed hands, before drawing 2 of his lightsabers. His brazenness summoned the Jedi to him in a flash, but he knew in the first moments of contest that he had nothing to worry about. Compared to Mace Windu, the 4 were mere novices, whose lightsaber techniques were some of the earliest Grievous had mastered. Behind him rushed his elite droids with a single purpose in mind, to tear into the guards and soldiers arrayed in a defensive semicircle in front of Palpatine. Tall, elegant-looking, dramatic in their red robes and face-mask cowls, the Supreme Chancellor's protectors were well-trained and fought with passion. Their fists and feet were fast and powerful, and their force pikes sliced and jabbed through the near-impervious armor of the droids. But they were no real match for fearless war machines, programmed to kill by any means possible. Perhaps if Palpatine had been intelligent enough to have surrounded himself with real Jedi of the caliber of Windu and the tentacle-headed Kit Fisto, the engagement might have gone differently. Fencing with his 4 adversaries, for that's all the fight amounted to, Grievous saw 6 of the soldiers and 3 of the Red Guards jolted to spasming deaths by the Magna Guard's double-tipped scepters. One of his elite had gone down as well, but even though blinded and savagely slashed by the guard's staffs, the droid was continuing to fight. And those elites, still on their feet, had altered their combat stances and offensive moves to adapt to the guard's defensive strategies. Grievous enjoyed going against so many Jedi simultaneously. If time wasn't of the essence, he might have protracted the fight. Feinting with the blade in his right hand, he removed the head of one Jedi with the blade in his left. Distracted when his right foot inadvertently booted the rolling head of his comrade, the Ithorian dropped his guard momentarily and received as penalty a thrust to the heart that dropped him to his knees before he pitched forward. Stepping back to absorb what had happened, the 2 remaining Jedi came at Grievous in concert, twirling and leaping about as if putting on some sort of crowd-pleasing martial arts demonstration. For practice, Grievous called 2 more blades from his belt, grasping them in his feet even as the anti-grav repulsors built into his legs were lifting him from the floor, making him every bit as agile as the Force did the Jedi. With his 4 blades to the Jedi's 2, the duel had come full circle. Whirling, he severed the blade hand of the Talls, then his opposing foot, then took his life as well. Mists of blood formed in the air, swirled about by the ventilators. The 4th he intimidated into retreat by wielding all 4 blades, transforming himself into a veritable chopping machine. Fear blossomed in the Twi'lek Jedi's dark eyes as she backed away. He had her on the run, poor thing. But he awarded her some measure of dignity by allowing her to land glancing blows on his forearms and shoulders. The burns did little more than add a new odor to the room. Emboldened, she pressed her attack, but was fast exhausting herself from the effort of trying to amputate one of his limbs. To hurt him in some fashion. And all for what? Grievous asked himself. The timid old man backed in the bunker's rear wall? The would-be champion of democracy who had loosed his clone army against the merchants and builders and traders who opposed his rule? His republic? Best to put the Jedi out of her misery, Grievous thought. Which he did with a single blade to the heart, for it would have been cruel to do otherwise. Elsewhere, his 3 surviving elites were doing well against 5 red guards. With time counting down, he waded into the thick of the action. Sensing him, one guard feinted a rotation to the left, then pivoted to the right with his force pike raised at face level. A move Grievous could appreciate, although he was no longer in the space where the weapon sliced. Using 2 blades, he nipped the guard's cowled head from his torso. Then next, he speared from behind in both kidneys. Opening the backs of another's thighs, he moved on, disemboweling the 4th. The last guard was already dead by the time he reached him. With a gesture, Grievous instructed his elite to secure the bunker's hexagonal door. Then, deactivating his lightsabers, he turned to Palpatine. "Now, Chancellor," he announced, "you're coming with us." Palpatine neither cowered nor protested. He merely said, "You will be a true loss to the forces you represent." The remark took Grievous by surprise. Was this praise? 4 Jedi Knights, all these soldiers and guards, Palpatine went on, gesturing broadly. Why not wait until Shaak Ti and Stas Ali arrive? He cocked his head to one side. I think I hear them coming. They are masters, after all. Grievous didn't respond immediately. Was Palpatine trying to trick him? I might at any other time, he said finally. But a ship awaits us that will take you from Coruscant, and from your cherished republic as well. Palpatine mocked him with a sneer. Do you actually believe that this plan will succeed? Grievous returned the look. You're more defiant than I was led to believe, Chancellor. But yes, the plan will succeed, and to your deficit, I would gladly kill you now but for my orders. So you take orders, Palpatine said, moving with deliberate lethargy. Which of us, then, is the lesser? Before Grievous could reply, he added, My death won't end this war, General. Grievous had wondered about that. Understandably, Lord Sidious had his plan, but did he actually believe that Palpatine's death would prompt the Jedi to lay down their lightsabers? Thrown into turmoil by the Chancellor's death, could the Senate order the Jedi to stand down? After years of warfare, would the Republic suddenly capitulate? The sound of rapid footfalls roused him, and he gestured to the bunker's rear door. Move, he told Palpatine. The Magna Guard stepped forward to make certain that Palpatine obeyed. Grievous hurried to the bunker's communication console. The stud switch and control pad for the emergency beacon were precisely where Tyrannus said they would be. After entering the code Tyrannus had provided, Grievous pressed his alloy hand to the switch. Palpatine watched him from the doorway. That will call many Jedi down on you, General, some of whom you may regret having summoned. Grievous glared at him. Only if they fail to challenge me. Chapter 51. Word of the firefight on the landing platform reached Mace and Kit in the gunship while they were returning to Sock. It hadn't taken long to piece together what had happened. The Separatists had managed to hijack a Republic gunship and infiltrate the bunker complex shield by timing their arrival to coincide with that of the ship carrying Palpatine, Shaak Ti, and the others. An ARC commander verified that the hijacked gunship had been piloted by droids. But the same ARC could neither confirm nor deny that Grievous had been aboard the destroyed ship. That alone was cause for concern. Mace and Kit thought they knew what had occurred, and hoped they were wrong. In the white glare of spotlights, the gunship that had been brought down by RPGs was a flaming hulk, dangling from the edge of the landing pad. Even less remained of the gunship that had delivered Palpatine to the complex. Fatalities of the surprise attack, one in a series of terrible surprises now, had been removed from the scene, but the pad boasted a company of reinforcements as well as two AT-STs that had been airdropped by wide-winged lat carriers. This time, Mace and Kit didn't wait for the gunship to touch down. Jumping from 5 meters up, they raced across the brightly illuminated landing platform and directly into the access tunnel. Steps into the tunnel, their worst fears were realized. When they saw 3 troopers hauling away a Magna Guard, holed by more blaster bolts than would have been needed to demolish a police skimmer. The hijacked gunship had rescued Grievous after his fall from the maglev, Mace told himself, but had the fall been deliberate, part of an increasingly elaborate ruse, or had Grievous originally planned to abduct Palpatine from the train? Either way, how had the cyborg general known how many of his forces to commit to such a daring plan? Unless, of course, he had received prior intelligence on the number of Red Guards in Palpatine's detail, and the number of troopers and other combatants stationed in the bunker complex. Every meter of the tunnel presented Mace and Kit with fresh evidence of the ferocious fight that had taken place, in the form of slaughtered commandos and others, without limbs, beheaded, shocked to death by EMP weapons. Mace stopped counting after he reached 40. The heavy hexagonal entrance that was the terminus of the blood-stained tunnel was open. If the fight leading to the door had been fierce, the one inside the ravished bunker had been savage. Stas Ali, her face and hands blistered and her robe singed, was kneeling by the bodies of the 4 Jedi Knights with whom Mace had spoken briefly during the maglev evacuation. Only Grievous could be held accountable for what had been done to them. The same was true for those Red Guards whose corpses had been burned open by lightsaber. Grievous had taken the blades with which the Jedi had fought. Here, too, were the shells of 2 more Magna Guards. But Palpatine was missing. "Sir, the Supreme Chancellor was gone by the time we arrived," a commando explained. "His captors exited the complex by way of the south tunnels." Mace and Kit glanced at the door that led to those tunnels, then turned to Shaak Ti, who was standing by the bunker's holoprojector table as if lost. When Mace hurried over to her, she practically collapsed in his arms. "I fought Grievous on Hippori," she said weakly. "I knew what he was capable of. But this? And taking Palpatine." Mace supported her. "There will be no negotiations. The Supreme Chancellor won't allow it." "The Senate may not see it that way, Mace." Shaak Ti composed herself and gazed around. Grievous had help from someone close to the top. Kit nodded. "We'll find out who, but our first priority is to rescue the Supreme Chancellor." Mace looked at the commando. "How did they leave the complex?" "I can show you," Shaak Ti said. Turning, she activated a security recording that had captured Grievous and several of his humanoid guards dragging Palpatine to the south landing pad, butchering the handful of troopers posted there, scrambling into a waiting tri-wing shuttle, lifting off into sunset clouds. "How were they allowed through the shield?" Mace asked the commando. "Same way they entered the bunker, General." Mace hadn't even thought to ask, had assumed they had burned their way in. "They had the entry codes to the bunker, sir, as well as codes issued today that permitted them to clear the screen." Mace and Kit glanced at each other in angry bewilderment. "What is the shuttle's location now?" Kit asked. The commando conjured a 3D image from the holoprojector. "Sector I-33, sir. Outbound auto navigation trunk P-17. Gunships are in pursuit." Mace's eyes widened in alert. "Do your gunners know that the Supreme Chancellor's aboard? Do they realize they can't fire on the shuttle?" "They have orders to disable if possible, sir. The shuttle is shielded and well armored in any case." "Who else knows of the abduction?" Kit thought to ask. "Has this been released or leaked to the media?" "Yes, sir. Moments ago." "On whose orders?" Mace fumed. "The Supreme Chancellor's top advisors." Shaak Ti forced an exhale. "All of Coruscant will panic." Mace squared his shoulders. "Commander, scramble every available starfighter. That ship cannot be allowed to reach the Separatist fleet." Chapter 52. Dooku hadn't fled alone. The only indications of Tyth's invasion were the hulking remains of Separatist and Republic warships, tumbling indolently in starlight. "We were all beginning to wonder if you were going to return," a human crew chief said by way of welcoming Obi-Wan and Anakin back to the assault cruiser's ventral landing bay. Obi-Wan descended the ladder fixed to the starfighter's cockpit. When did the Separatists jump? Less than an hour local. Guess they had enough of the pounding we were giving them. Leaping to the deck, Anakin laughed nastily. Believe whatever you want. The crew chief furrowed his brow in uncertainty. Do we know where they're headed? Obi-Wan asked quickly. The crew chief turned to him. Most of the capital ships jumped rimward. A few appear to be headed for the Nelvin system, 13 parsecs from here. What are our orders? We're still waiting to find out. The fact is, we haven't received any communications from Coruscant since the start of the battle. Anakin took a sudden interest in the crew chief's remarks. Could be local interference, Obi-Wan said. The crew chief looked dubious. Several other battle groups reported they have been unable to communicate with Coruscant. Anakin shot Obi-Wan an embittered look and began to storm away. Anakin, Obi-Wan said, following in his footsteps. Anakin whirled on him. We were wrong to come here, Master. I was wrong to come here. It was all feint, and we fell for it. We're being kept away from Coruscant. I can feel it. Obi-Wan folded his arms across his chest. You wouldn't be saying that if we'd captured Dooku. But we didn't, Master. That's what counts. And now no communication with Coruscant? You don't even see it, do you? Obi-Wan regarded him carefully. See what, Anakin? Anakin started to speak, then cut himself off and began again. You should keep me fighting. You shouldn't give me time to think. Obi-Wan rested his hands on Anakin's shoulders. Calm yourself. Anakin shrugged him off, a new fire in his eyes. You're my best friend. Tell me what I should do. Forget for a moment that you're wearing the robes of a Jedi and tell me what I should do. Stung by the gravity in Anakin's voice, Obi-Wan fell silent for a moment, then said, The Force is our ally, Anakin. When we're mindful of the Force, our actions are in accord with the will of the Force. Tyth wasn't a wrong choice. It's simply that we're ignorant of its import in the greater scheme. Anakin lowered his head in sadness. You're right, Master. My mind isn't as fast as my lightsaber. He stared at his artificial limb. My heart isn't as pervious to pain as my right hand. Obi-Wan felt as if someone had gnawed at his insides. He had failed his apprentice and closest friend. Anakin was suffering, and the only balm he offered were Jedi platitudes. His body heaved a stuttering breath. He had his mouth open to speak when the crew chief interrupted. General Skywalker, something has your astromech very flustered. Obi-Wan and Anakin swung to Anakin's starfighter. R2? Anakin said in a concerned tone. The astromech tooted, shrilled, chittered. Does he understand droid? The crew chief asked Obi-Wan as Anakin hurried past him. That droid, Obi-Wan said. Anakin began to scale the cockpit ladder. What is it, R2? What's wrong? The droid whistled and zithered. Throwing himself into the open cockpit, Anakin toggled switches. Obi-Wan had just reached the base of the ladder when he heard Palpatine's voice issuing through the cockpit annunciators. Anakin, if you're receiving this message, then I have urgent need of your help. The crew chief's comlink toned. Obi-Wan glanced from the crew chief to Anakin and back again. What is it? He asked in a rush. Tight being calm from Coruscant, the crew said. He listened for another moment, then added, in obvious disbelief, Sir, the Separatists have invaded. Obi-Wan gaped at him. Above him, Anakin lifted his face to the high ceiling and let out a sustained snarl. Glaring down at Obi-Wan, he said, Why does fate target the people who are the most important to me? Crew chief, Anakin cut him off. Refuel and rearm our starfighters at once. Chapter 53. Grievous had a good lead on them. Seated in the co-pilot's seat of a Republic cruiser, Mace accepted that the shuttle couldn't be intercepted before it left Coruscant's envelope, and perhaps not before it was in the protective embrace of the Separatist fleet. Regardless, the hot, scrambled starfighters were giving all they had to the chase. Having access to high-clearance codes, Grievous could have plotted a proprietary launch vector for the shuttle, but by doing so, he would have put the shuttle at risk of arrest by disabling fire and tractor beam. Instead, he'd elected to avail himself of the protection afforded by starship traffic in one of the outbound auto-navigation trunks. Police, governmental, and emergency vessels were permitted to use free travel lanes that paralleled the trunks, but even with that advantage, Mason Kitt's cruiser was still several kilometers behind the rising shuttle. Below, vast areas of darkness stained the usual circuit board perfection of nightside Coruscant. That the vessels surrounding it were compelled by orbital tractor beam arrays to adhere to standard launch velocities benefited the shuttle. The Tri-Wing benefited even more from the fact that Grievous was almost as adept at handling a ship as he was a lightsaber. Each time flights of starfighters attempted to hem him in, Grievous would lead them on spiraling chases through the thick traffic, inserting the shuttle between ships, initiating collisions, resorting to firing the shuttle's meager weapons when necessary. Recalled from the battle outside the well, Agent Kolar, Sassy Tin, and Pablo Jill had come closest to incapacitating the shuttle, but, twice now, Grievous had managed to evade them by bringing the shuttle's laser cannons to bear on cargo pods and strewing local space with debris. Even when the three Jedi had gotten near enough to launch disabling runs, the shuttle's shielding and armor had absorbed the bursts. With the pursuit closing rapidly on the rim of the gravity well, the Jedi pilots were executing maneuvers they had been reluctant to employ deeper in the atmosphere. Weaving among the vessels, the starfighters fired on the shuttle at every opportunity, scorching its wings and tail as the shield generator became overtaxed. Grievous was unable to match them maneuver for maneuver, but his response to the attacks was to target any innocent in his sights, ultimately forcing the Jedi to fall back once again. Punching through Coruscant's sheath of gases, the auto-navigation trunk branched like the crown of a shade tree. Thrusters flared as endangered ships slewed and rolled onto vectors meant to distance them from the fray. With local space crosshatched with plasma trails and brilliant with explosions, escape was scarcely an option. Even so, many ships were attempting to follow the curve of the gravity well toward Coruscant's bright side, while others veered for the safety of Coruscant's moons, and still others sped for the nearest jump points. Except for the shuttle, which accelerated straight for Grievous's flagship. Calling full power from the cruiser, Kit Fisto joined the three Jedi starfighters in a flat-out race for the shuttle. By then, too, several Republic frigates and corvettes were diverting from the principal battle to assist in the interception. Despite his earlier misgivings, Mace thought for a moment that they might succeed. Then he watched in disquiet as 500 droid fighters, gushing from the great curving arms of a Trade Federation battleship, swarmed forward to safeguard the shuttle in its flight to freedom. Three among a crowd several hundred strong, standing in the Nicandron Plaza, Padme, Bail, and Mon Mothma watched the late-breaking news report on the Embassy Mall's HoloNet monitor. When word of Supreme Chancellor Palpatine's capture had first been rumored, then verified, all anyone in the crowd could ask was, how in 3 short years had it come to this? The armies of chaos were parked in stationary orbit above Coruscant, and the beloved leader of the Galactic Republic seized. For so many, what had been an abstraction was stark reality, playing out overhead for all of Coruscant and half the galaxy to watch. Now that time had passed, however, Padme had begun to notice a change in the crowd. Though a climactic battle was raging as near as the night sky's frightening fireworks, most Coruscanti preferred to keep their gaze fixed on the real-time images of battle. That way, it was almost like watching an exciting HoloNet drama. Would the starfighters be able to overtake the shuttle in which Palpatine was being held captive by a cyborg monster? Might the shuttle or the flagship that it was its destination explode? What would become of the Republic should the Supreme Chancellor be killed, or Coruscant occupied by tens of thousands of battle droids? Would the Jedi and their clone army fly to the rescue? When Padme could take no more of the 3D images or the remarks of the audience, she wended her way to the perimeter of the crowd to take hold of a handrail at the plaza's edge, and to lift her eyes to the strobing sky. Anakin, she said to herself, as if she could reach him with thought. Anakin. Tears coursed down her cheeks, and she wiped them away at the back of her hand. Her sadness was personal now. Not for Palpatine, though his abduction hollowed her. She wept for a future she and Anakin might have had, for the family they might have been. More than ever, she wished that she hadn't been a featured player in the events that had shaped the war, but merely one of the crowd. Come home to me before it's too late. Her gaze lowered. She caught sight of C-3PO parting company with a silver protocol droid that disappeared into the crowd. What was that about, 3PO? She asked as he approached. A most curious encounter, mistress, C-3PO said. I think that shiny droid fancies himself something of a seer. Padme looked at him askance. In what way, 3PO? In essence, he told me to flee while it was still possible. He said that dark times are coming, and that the line that separates good and bad will become blurred, that what seems good now will prove evil, and that what seems evil will prove good. Sensing there was more, Padme waited. C-3PO's photoreceptors locked on Padme. He said further that I should accept a memory wipe if it was ever offered to me, because the only alternative would be to live in fear and confusion for the rest of my days. Chapter 54. Slapped by fire, the tri-winged shuttle fairly crawled toward the docking bay of the Invisible Hand. Grievous held to his treacherous course, even while contingency plans formed in his mind. Wings of Trade Federation droid fighters had burned a path for the shuttle through areas of intense combat, but the vulnerable little ship was not yet in the clear. Many of Grievous's impassioned pursuers were so busy defending themselves that they no longer represented a threat, but 3 starfighters had managed to stay with the shuttle and were continuing to harry it with surgical fire. The spiraling chase up the gravity well and the twisting transit to the cruiser had left the ship battered. The sublight engine was whining in protest, the ray shield dangerously diminished, the minimal weapons depleted. Uncertain as to where Grievous had stashed Palpatine, the pilots of the trio of starfighters were being careful with their bolts. But every hit was inflicting further damage to the stabilizers and shield generator. Plasma fire from the Invisible Hand's point defense weapons had only prompted them to close ranks with the shuttle, using it in the same way Grievous was using Palpatine, as a kind of screen. The mechanical voice of a control droid aboard the cruiser issued from the shuttle's cockpit speakers. "General, do you wish us to deploy tri-fighters against the starfighters?" "Negative," Grievous said. "Save them for when we actually need them. Continue cannon fire." "General, our computations suggest that continued close-range fire could subject the shuttle to fracturicide." Grievous didn't doubt it. As it was, the hull was blistering with each salvo from the cruiser. "Ready the forward tractor beam," he said after a moment. "Fire a disabling burst at all 4 of us, then utilize the beam to ensnare what remains of the shuttle and draw it into the docking bay, even if that means dragging a starfighter in as well. Have battle droids standing by." "Yes, General." Grievous swiveled in his seat toward Palpatine, who was strapped into an acceleration couch between 2 Magna Guards. The Supreme Chancellor had been unexpectedly compliant since leaving the bunker, at times brazen enough to take Grievous to task for his less than perfect piloting skills. "You fool, you'll get us both killed," Palpatine had barked at him repeatedly. What did Palpatine think was going to become of him after they reached the Invisible Hand? Grievous had asked himself. Was he under the delusion that Lord Sidious and Tyrannus would simply hold him for ransom? Did it somehow escape him that he wasn't likely to see Coruscant again? Once more, Grievous questioned the needless complexity of the Sith Lord's plan. Why not kill Palpatine sooner rather than later? If he hadn't been under orders. "You take orders?" Palpatine had mocked him. Which of them was the lesser indeed? "Strap in, Chancellor," Grievous said now. "This could get rough." Palpatine sneered. "With you at the controls, I'm certain it will." No sooner did Grievous swing back to the viewport than gouts of fire spewed from the Invisible Hand's forward cannons. 2 of the starfighter pilots must have sensed something coming, because they all but glued themselves to the shuttle. Rocked by the burst, the shuttle lost portions of itself to space, and all systems shut down. One of the starfighters was blown away, but the other 2 had lost little more than their wings. The shuttle reared as the tractor beam took hold of it. With it came the pair of starfighters. Grievous considered ordering that the docking bay be purged of atmosphere. Somewhere aboard the shuttle there would be extravehicular gear Palpatine could get on, but with life support failing, Palpatine was already in enough trouble. Grievous would just have to deal with the starfighter pilots when the ships were released from the beam. The 3 were scarcely through the docking bay's containment field when explosive charges flung the canopies from the starfighters and 2 Jedi Knights leapt to the deck, lightsabers ablaze, deflecting blaster bolts from battle droids as they raced for the shuttle. Before the shuttle had even settled to the deck, one of the Jedi had plunged his glowing blue blades straight through the starboard hatch. Hurrying aft through thickening smoke, Grievous caught sight of Palpatine's expression of derision. "Surprise, surprise, General." Grievous halted just long enough to say, "We'll see who's surprised." He saw the lightsaber blade retract. By the time he had shouldered through the hatch onto the landing platform, the Jedi had moved to either side. Even while continuing to parry blaster bolts, they surged at him, engaging the two lightsabers he drew from his cloak. The duel raged through the hold. Battle droids lowered their weapons for fear of hitting Grievous. These Jedi were more proficient than the ones he had fought in the bunker, but not skilled enough to challenge him. The four blades seared through the recycled air, washing the burnished bulkheads with harsh light and outsized shadows. Flanking him, the Jedi rushed in. Grievous waited until the last instant to command his legs to raise him up several centimeters. Then he extended his lightsaber straight out from his sides, angled slightly downward. Slipping past the flashing strikes of his opponents, Grievous's blades pierced the chests of both. They fell away from him, faces contorted in surprise, of the sort only sudden death could bring. Several battle droids hastened forward, almost prancing in eagerness. "Jettison the bodies," Grievous instructed. "Choose a place where the Republic can have a good look at them." Diminutive between two Magna Guards, Palpatine was waiting at the foot of the shuttle boarding ramp. "Take him," Grievous said. Lifting Palpatine by his armpits, the combat droids followed Grievous through the cruiser, and at last through an oval of opalescent portal into a large cabin space containing a situation table surrounded by chairs. Grievous ordered the guards to set the Supreme Chancellor down in a swivel chair at the head of the table and to shackle his hands. "Welcome to the General's quarters," he said while he did input at a console built into the table. Shortly, the bulkhead behind the swivel chair became a hologramic display showing the Battle of Coruscant. The flick of a final switch summoned a stalked, eyeball-shaped holocam from the tabletop. "You're about to make an unscheduled appearance on the HoloNet, Chancellor," Grievous said. "I apologize for not providing a mere hairbrush and cosmetics, so that you might at least camouflage some of your fear." Palpatine's voice was sinister when he spoke. "You can display me, but I won't speak." Grievous nodded at what seemed an obvious statement. "I'll display you, but you won't speak. Is that understood?" "You will do all the talking." "That's correct. I will do all the talking." "Very good." For no apparent reason, Grievous felt uncertain. "Lord Tyrannus will soon be here to take charge of you." Palpatine smiled without showing his teeth. "Then I am assured of being greatly entertained." From aboard his cruiser, General Grievous addressed a captive audience of trillions of beings. His frightening visage dominating every frequency of the HoloNet, he delivered a message of gloom and doom, forecasting the end of Palpatine's reign, the long, delinquent downfall of the corrupt Republic, a bright new future for all the worlds and all the species that had been enslaved to it. Crushed in among Nikandra Plaza's suddenly silent multitude, Bail touched Mon Mothma's arm in a gesture that promised his imminent return, and began to writhe his way to the edge of the crowd. Gazing around, he spied Padme standing with C-3PO, arms cradled against her, elbows in the palms of her hands, her face raised to the light-splintered sky. Hastening to her, he called her name, and she turned from the handrail into his comforting embrace, her tears wetting the front of his tunic. "Padme, listen to me," he said, stroking her hair. "The Separatists have nothing to gain by killing Palpatine. He'll be all right." "What if you're wrong, Bail? What if they do kill him, and power falls into the hands of Mas Amedda and the rest of that gang? That doesn't worry you? What if Alderaan is next on Grievous's list of worlds to attack?" "Of course it worries me. I fear for Alderaan. But I have faith that won't happen. This attack will put an end to the Outer Rim sieges. The Jedi will be back where they belong, here in the core. And as for Mas Amedda, he won't last a week. There are thousands of senators who think as we do, Padme. We'll rally them into a force to be reckoned with. We'll put the Republic back on course, even if we have to fight tooth and nail to overcome anyone who opposes us." He put his hand under her chin to lift her face toward his. "We'll get through this, no matter what." She sniffled, smiled lightly. "If I could keep my concerns focused only on the future of the Republic." Bail held her gaze and nodded in understanding. "Padme, if it's any comfort to you, please know that my wife and I would do anything to protect you and those close to you." "Thank you, Bail," she said, "with all my heart. Thank you." On Utapau, an outer rim world of vast sinkholes and lizard mounts, Viceroy Newt Gunray watched a grainy HoloNet image of General Grievous lower the boom on Coruscant. Had he been wrong to underestimate the cyborg? Might this war actually end with the Republic vanquished? It was almost too much to contemplate. Unrestricted trade from core to outer rim, undreamed of wealth, unlimited possessions. Gunray glanced at Shumai, Pestle Argent, San Hill, and the rest, a backslapping fellowship all of a sudden. Smiling broadly, for the first time in several years, he joined them in celebration. In his quarters in the temple, Yoda watched a holonet feed that showed the bodies of 2 Jedi drifting in space, close to the flagship of the Separatist fleet. The corners of his mouth pulled down in sadness. He turned to the comlink. "See them, I do." Mace's voice rumbled from the speaker. "If we can ever break through this fighter screen, we'll storm the cruiser." "Kill the Supreme Chancellor, Grievous will." "I don't think so. He's had plenty of chances already." "Wait, then. To hear the Separatist demands, we should." "The Senate will give away Coruscant to effect Palpatine's release." "Worse the situation will be if the Supreme Chancellor dies. Fall the Republic will." Mace fell silent for a moment. Yoda saw him in the cockpit of the cruiser he and Kit had piloted off Coruscant. "What should we do?" "To the Force. Look for guidance. Accept what fate has placed before us. For now, prevent Grievous's fleet from escaping to hyperspace, you must. Recalled, many Jedi and others have been. Turn, the battle will when they arrive." "Master Yoda, we are close to capturing Sidious. I could feel it." "Knew this, Sidious did. Hiding he is." No longer in Coruscant, Yoda thought. "We'll pin Grievous here, like the vermin he is." Mace severed the transmission, and Yoda tottered to the windows. Western Coruscant was engulfed by darkness, the sky above splintered by rapid light. Calling his lightsaber to his hand, he ignited the blade and waved it through the air. Perilous the future will be, a cause for grave concern. But the battle in local space wasn't the end. Beginning, the final act was. Chapter 55. Dooku had ordered the droid pilot of the sloop to revert from hyperspace for a brief time at the planet Nelvan. Should any ships among the Republic battle group at Tythe plot his escape course, it would appear that Nelvan was his destination. The sloop's Geonosian technology would mask the fact that he had almost jumped immediately to Coruscant to join Grievous, and to play out the final act of the drama Sidious had composed. The abduction of Palpatine had not only abbreviated the search for him, but also allowed Sidious to escape Coruscant undetected. But those events had been minor acts. Sidious would never have allowed the Jedi to expose him, and Palpatine was hardly the prize he appeared to be. The greater prize, Sidious had told Dooku during their most recent communication, was Anakin Skywalker. "Long have you watched him," Dooku had said, repeating words Sidious himself had spoken. "Longer than you know, Lord Tyrannus. Longer than you know. And the time has come to test him again." "His skills, my lord?" "The depth of his anger, his willingness to go beyond the Force, as the Jedi know it, and to call on the power of the dark side. General Grievous will activate a special beacon that will call Skywalker and Kenobi back to Coruscant, and onto the stage we will set for them. But not to capture them. You will duel them," Sidious had said. "Kill Kenobi. His only purpose is to die, and in doing so, ignite young Skywalker to tap the depths of his fear and rage. Should you defeat Skywalker easily, then we will know that he is not prepared to serve us. Perhaps he never will be prepared. Should he by some fluke best you, however, I will control the outcome to spare you any unnecessary embarrassment, and we will have gained a powerful ally. But above all, you must make the contest appear real, Lord Tyrannus." "I will treat it as if it were my crowning achievement," Dooku had promised. Hyperspace awaited. "To Coruscant," he told FA-4 from his comfortable chair in the sloop's main hold. And with that, the ship jumped. Chapter 56. The two starfighters sat side by side in the launching bay, only a few meters separating them, engines warming, droids in their sockets, cockpit canopies raised. Neither pilot wore a helmet, so Anakin could hear Obi-Wan plainly when he shouted, "For all the jinks and jukes you've taken me through, there's no one else I'd rather fly with." Anakin canted his head and smiled. "It's about time you admitted it. Can I take that to mean you'll follow my lead without question?" To the best of my ability, Obi-Wan said. I may not always be able to remain at your wing, but I won't be far off, and I'll always have your back. When I call for help, you'll come speeding to the rescue. The day you call for help, I'll know that we're both in and over our heads. Anakin adopted a serious look. Obi-Wan, you don't know how many times you've already rescued me. Obi-Wan swallowed the lump that formed in his throat. Then whatever lies ahead for us shouldn't be a problem. Anakin laughed lightly. Who will restore peace to the galaxy if we don't? Obi-Wan returned a tight-lipped nod. At least you said we. They lowered the starfighter's canopies and engaged their repulsors, lifting off, rotating 180 degrees, and easing through the launching bay's transparent containment field. Flying abreast, all but sharing a wing, they enabled their thrusters and banked away from the massive ship. Accelerating on columns of brilliant blue energy, slewing slightly to port, slightly sinister, they coupled with their hyperdrive rings and disappeared into the long night. To be concluded. James Luceno is the New York Times best-selling author of the Star Wars, The New Jedi Order novels, Agents of Chaos 1, Hero's Trial, Agents of Chaos 2, Jedi Eclipse, and The Unifying Force, as well as Star Wars Cloak of Deception and the ebook Darth Maul Saboteur. He also co-authored the popular Robotech series with his close friend, the late Brian Daley. Luceno wrote the film adaptations for The Shadow and The Mask of Zorro. He lives in Annapolis, Maryland, with his wife and youngest child. This has been Star Wars, Labyrinth of Evil by James Luceno. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed my reading of this audiobook and would like to contribute, you can head on over to www.patreon.com/theexpandeduniverselives forever. The link is also in the video's description.